A ruined wedding dress became the beginning of a mafia war. 1 hour before the vows, Vivienne was a business asset in white lace. One night later, she was inside Lucien Valles' fortress, holding evidence that could destroy Damien Torres, her father, and the entire merger built on corruption. They expected her to cry, apologize, and come home. Instead, she walked into the war room and said, "Burn it all down." The subject, Vivienne, sits paralyzed in a freezing Miami downpour. Her soaked bridal gown acts as a visual marker of acute psychological trauma. Hours prior, she suffered an unimaginable betrayal, discovering her fiancé with her own sister, her family, operating with cold narcissistic pragmatism, demanded she endure the infidelity to secure a corporate merger. The clinical lesson here is brutal. The deepest wounds usually come from your primary attachment figures. A black sedan cuts through the storm, delivering Lucien Valles, a calculated mastermind of the underworld. He steps into the rain, draping his coat over her shivering frame, quietly asking who broke her. Today, you and I are going to analyze this case file together, because this cycle of manipulation is just beginning. Let us rewind the timeline by 3 hours. The atmosphere in the bridal suite is suffocating, thick with unspoken guilt. The bridesmaids exhibit classic avoidance behavior, refusing eye contact. We instinctively sense when an environment turns hostile, always trust that biological alarm. Vivienne searches the halls, opening a door, only to witness her psychological foundation shatter. Her fiancé, Damien, is intimately entangled with her sister. Clinically speaking, the infidelity is secondary to his terrifying lack of remorse. Damien merely adjusts his tie, flashing the toxic smirk of a true malignant narcissist, and gaslights her by claiming she is overreacting. When the pathological mask slips, believe the monster underneath. She flees into the storm. The most revealing detail, no one followed her. Returning to the present moment, Vivienne sits anchored to the freezing marble, displaying severe dissociative symptoms. A heavy car door slams nearby, but her startled response is completely suppressed by the psychological shock. Deliberate, rhythmic footsteps approach. A low voice cuts through the auditory chaos of the storm, calmly warning her about the temperature. Exhausted by the coercive control of manipulative men, she exhibits a defensive trauma response, snapping that she is fine. The stranger calmly gestures to her ruined dress. Sometimes a complete systemic collapse is the only way to rebuild a healthy foundation. She lifts her chin, locking eyes with a man who embodies the dark triad of personality traits. He stands defiant in the downpour, radiating the quiet, predatory calm of an apex threat. We observe his heavy gaze, the unwavering stare typical of those who dominate their environment. This is Lucien Valles, the calculated architect of the city crime syndicate. He operates entirely in the shadows, orchestrating systemic violence with clinical precision. Even her narcissistic former fiancé displayed a fear response at his mere mention. Lucien demonstrates a fundamental behavioral rule: genuine authority never relies on volume or theatrics. Holding his umbrella perfectly still, he voices her name as an absolute fact. Vivienne Mercer. Staring at the most lethal variable in Miami, she bitterly states she traded that identity away for nothing. In that precise second, notice the micro-expression on Lucien's face. A brief flicker of authentic intrigue breaches his rigidly controlled, psychopathic exterior. The subject steps into her personal space, adjusting his umbrella to shield her. He asks a single probing question, triggering a massive emotional release. Vivienne verbalizes the agonizing trauma of the betrayal, exposing parents who prioritized corporate leverage over their child's psychological well-being. It is a grim reality of familial abuse. Sometimes radical severance is the only valid survival strategy. Displaying sudden hypervigilance, she challenges his motives. Lucian's jaw tightens in a display of suppressed hostility. When he articulates the name Damien Torres, the syllables are laced with lethal intent. She asks if they are aligned, and his denial is absolute. Silently, he drapes his heavy coat over her. She is immediately enveloped by his scent, a sensory anchor to his overwhelming, calculated dominance. Lucian maintains a flat, unemotional effect as he states she cannot stay in the storm. Vivian responds with a fractured laugh, detailing the systemic isolation of her abuse. Her housing, her finances, her entire social network, all surgically tethered to the narcissist who betrayed her. This highlights a terrifying principle of behavioral conditioning. The moment you delegate control of your survival resources, you become a hostage. Lucian processes this data silently, clinically assessing the invisible psychological cage trapping her. He offers his hand, issuing a quiet, active directive that she has a destination tonight.
Entering his armored vehicle, Vivian's amygdala fires warning signals to flee the predator beside her.
However, acute emotional exhaustion has completely overridden her nervous system, paralyzing any instinct to run. Inside the insulated cabin, her abuser's voice loops endlessly in Vivian's mind. You and I have likely observed this phenomenon before. Victims often allow toxic individuals to occupy their mental real estate long after the physical threat is gone. One must actively sever these cognitive loops to restore sanity. When she questions their trajectory, the kingpin displays a calculated softening, revealing they are heading to his private compound. Exhibiting healthy skepticism, she asks if a ruthless syndicate leader habitually collects traumatized strays. A micro-expression of amusement alters his rigid features. He states his assets are impenetrable, placing her under his direct jurisdiction. She defensively asserts she is not his property. Lucian simply agrees. He notes she is currently untethered and that total isolation is the exact foundation of absolute autonomy. The subject's compound is a brutalist fortress of glass and blackened steel, designed to project absolute dominance over the environment. Vivian crosses the threshold, her ruined shoes echoing against the stone in a stark auditory contrast. The space is a monument to megalomania. Note the behavioral baseline here: true, unassailable power operates in a vacuum of silence, never requiring elevation of volume. A highly vigilant matriarch, Mrs. Kwan, emerges from the perimeter. Identifying the traumatized woman, she challenges Lucian for introducing an unpredictable variable into their controlled space. Lucian's physiological state remains entirely static. He locks eyes with the caretaker, formally dictates Vivian's identity, and establishes the new behavioral paradigm. She is under his direct shield, and his monotone directive is absolute, unquestionable law. The caretaker escorts Vivian upward, initiating the physical decontamination of her trauma. Ascending the stairs, Vivian perceives the intense, evaluative stare of her host. She halts, demanding the underlying psychological motive for this manufactured rescue. Lucian remains motionless in the lower shadows. Illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning, his true motive is fully unmasked. He reveals that Damien Torres previously sabotaged his syndicate, and the organizational equilibrium requires retaliation. He retreats into the darkness. The cognitive dissonance resolves instantly for Vivian. She has not been rescued. She has been acquired as a strategic weapon. A foundational law of survival applies here. When a predator grants you access to a gilded enclosure, Do not mistake comfortable confinement for liberty. You have merely been drafted into a much more lethal psychological game. Observe the ritualistic nature of this transition. The caretaker provides Dark's sensory soothing garments. Vivian strips off the saturated gown, discarding the primary artifact of her humiliation onto the floor. She utilizes scalding water in a desperate attempt to physically eradicate the psychological contamination of her abuser's proximity. Entering the sterile bedroom, her device emits a stark light, 17 missed communications. Her father exhibiting narcissistic rage, her sister deploying manipulative weeping, and her mother obsessing over fractured financial leverage. Severing primary attachment figures induces severe psychological distress, but preserving one's mental architecture is paramount. In a moment of absolute clarity, she blocks the entire family system, permanently severing the pathogenic bond, right as the matriarch enters with a warm meal. The subject receives the sustenance from the caretaker, who deploys a maternal tone, instructing her to eat and noting her physiological stabilization. As the food slowly regulates her central nervous system, Vivian attempts to map her new environment. She probes the matriarch about syndicate leader's developmental history. The older woman recounts over 2 decades of proximity, referencing a time when the kingpin exhibited normal adolescent impulsivity. When Vivian asks if any baseline empathy remains, the caretaker offers a grim prognosis. He is entirely lethal now, operating with high-functioning ruthlessness, though she claims a fractured morality still exists deep down. She verifies the core catalyst Damien sabotaged his empire. Vivian's acquisition was a highly calculated chess move. Never underestimate a mind completely fixated on systematic retaliation. Let us analyze this specific psychological pivot together. The caretaker locks eyes with Vivian, stripping away all defensive rationalizations. She presents a binary choice: remain a passive victim of narcissistic abuse, or adopt manipulative tactics and use the apex predator right back. It is confirmed that the kingpin's actions are entirely devoid of altruism. Hours pass and severe insomnia sets in. Vivian's mind loops endlessly through the traumatic stimuli of the day. By 2 a.m, her coping mechanisms fail. Wrapping herself in thick fabric, she navigates the silent, cavernous architecture of the estate. She lacks a destination, driven entirely by a compulsion to outrun her toxic legacy. In clinical terms, abandoning every known variable and stepping completely into the dark unknown is often the exact mechanism required for a profound psychological rebirth. Vivian drifts onto the terrace, moving with the dissociative grace of a trauma victim. The biting chill crashes against her. Framed against the black canvas of Miami Bay stands Lucian, an apex predator clutching amber liquor. He exudes the heavy gravity of a syndicate sovereign. A mere shift of his shoulders signals he has registered her presence. His voice is an unpolished murmur, probing to see if her nervous system allowed her any sleep. Defiant, a classic defense mechanism, she asks if he ever does. They stand parallel as the storm dies. The human psyche is utterly predictable here. We invariably seek out the mirror of our own darkest pathologies in the shattered souls around us. She inhales the sharp ozone, bracing herself to ask the question burning through her composure. You and I have reviewed countless case files just like this, noting the exact moment a victim's reality shatters. Vivian suffers a cognitive collapse as the underworld's depravity crystallizes. Lucian drops his tone into a chilling register, clinically detailing how a megalomaniacal narcissist named Damien framed his brother Ethan to steal an empire. But the true psychological dagger follows. Vivian discovers her own father orchestrated the illicit exchange. Her patriarchal figure commodified her, trading her flesh to sanitize a psychopath's reputation. The betrayal triggers an acute nervous system response, stealing her breath. I must always emphasize this truth. Your inherent human value is never dictated by the malignant individuals who attempt to barter your autonomy. The dark acts as an isolation chamber, allowing Lucien to lower his rigid defenses. He murmurs that he intimately recognizes her psychological fracture. The space between them vibrates with the frequency of trauma bonding. Suspended above the city, Vivian should be exhibiting acute panic. Instead, a paradoxical calm neutralizes her tremors. She asks the syndicate leader if she is merely a tactical pawn against Damien. Lucien confesses that was his protocol until her presence disrupted his behavioral baseline. He guarantees her security. She releases a cynical laugh at the madness of seeking refuge with an offender. The human mind is highly adaptable. The most terrifying environments can bizarrely manifest as the exact sanctuary a shattered psyche requires to heal. Vivian calculates the arithmetic of her survival clinically. Her options form a closed loop of destruction. Returning to a pathological family is unviable, and confronting Damien guarantees fatal consequences. She vocalizes her trauma, confessing his coercive control suppressed her ability to function. Lucien maintains eye contact, simply instructing her to stay. She probes for the transactional cost of his protection. His jaw clenches, stating he never extracts debts from devastated victims. She observes this predator offering unconditional harbor, appearing more like a combat-fatigued veteran. It teaches us a vital principle. Individuals who impose zero transactional demands upon your fractured spirit are frequently the ones equipped to offer the profound healing you need. Vivian rejects the role of a trauma victim. A rupture occurs, dismantling the emotional barricades constructed after her betrayal. Operating on pure instinct, her trembling fingers initiate contact with Lucien. His musculature locks into rigidity, the reflex of a subject conditioned for violence over affection. Yet, he endures the touch. She murmurs a fragile expression of gratitude. This marks a critical dopamine surge, the spark of hope. We observe a fundamental truth in recovery here. Stepping into unmapped territory triggers intense phobic paralysis, but it remains the singular method to rewrite a damaged destiny. Morning arrives sharply. She wakes to dark coffee, recognizing the heavy sweater nearby as empirical evidence. She is a willing captive inside a criminal fortress. Examine this pathology. While Damien exhibits destructive mania, Vivian dissociates into the kitchen. A young male is present, showing the reckless posturing of profound trauma. He antagonizes Vivian, labeling her the runaway bride. When reprimanded, his defensive armor fractures. He identifies himself as Ethan, the sibling Damien methodically erased. Vivian experiences an acute stress response, swearing ignorance of his ruin. Ethan displays a flattened affect, offering a hollow shrug. This is the methodology of a megalomaniac. It underscores a persistent psychological axiom. No matter how deeply a malignant narcissist conceals their systemic abuse, the empirical truth will eventually bleed out. A hot plate is slid forward, a firm command to consume calories and survive. The caretaker notes Vivian's caloric deficit, directing her to sit. Ethan invades her proximity, conducting a hostile interrogation. He demands to know if she seeks a protective barrier, retaliatory violence, or a trauma bond. Vivian confesses a primal objective, basic biological survival. That raw transparency de-escalates Ethan's hypervigilance. He outlines the stark reality. Lucian possesses a terrifying capacity for violence, but his pack loyalty is pathological. Within this perimeter, she is secure. A predatory affect shifts Ethan's features. Lucian has endured years of dormant latency, and she is the ultimate psychological trigger. Note this human pattern. Impregnable alliances are frequently forged between shattered individuals united against a mutual, malignant predator. Ethan is submerged in chronic anger. Vivian recognizes that psychological friction. The caretaker questions her mental readiness for collateral damage. This is no longer a domestic dispute. It is a syndicate conflict. A megalomaniac like Damien cannot allow his narcissistic supply to flee. As for Lucian, the apex predator has been artificially suppressed, and Vivian has removed his constraints. Footsteps rupture the sensory baseline. Lucian enters, projecting lethal authority, and delivers a devastating cognitive blow. The latency phase is terminated. Damien knows her coordinates and arrives today. You and I must acknowledge a painful therapeutic reality. Fleeing a toxic cycle rarely neutralizes the threat. Eventually, a victim must arrest their flight response and confront the pathology head-on. Lucian strips his tone of emotional resonance. He presents a bifurcated choice. The first protocol is systematic erasure. He will facilitate her extraction with a fabricated identity, ensuring permanent dissociation. The alternative requires weaponizing her trauma. She remains as high-value bait to dismantle Damien's narcissistic facade and induce a cognitive error. Then, Lucian will eliminate his rival. A pressurized silence envelops the room. Vivian analyzes his micro-expressions, predicting the collateral mortality. Lucian exhibits zero autonomic arousal, noting that physical violence is the sole dialect a psychopath comprehends. He mandates her decision. Study this phase. Psychological sovereignty is synthesized the exact millisecond a subject refuses to let an abuser dictate their survival. Vivian grounds herself, combating an acute amygdala hijack. Her biological imperative demands the avoidance protocol. Yet, a memory of Damien's narcissism acts as a cognitive stimulant. She establishes ocular dominance with Lucian, resigning as a subjugated victim to become an active, lethal variable. Lucian's pupils dilate with terrifying respect, forming an unspoken contract. Once the abuser is eradicated, her autonomy is absolute. She regulates her breathing and confirms she is staying. Lucian's detachment fractures into a predatory, sociopathic smile. He murmurs her timing is optimal. The target has breached the perimeter. Remember this clinical reality. Chronic avoidance merely postpones the inevitable psychological collision. True remission demands that you stand your ground and fight. Let us examine this threshold together. The doorbell ruptures the baseline, acting as a psychological trigger. Vivian experiences temporary catatonia, her motor skills degrading as she fixates on the glass. The architect of her ruin, Damien, is present. Lucian maintains terrifying, reptilian stillness, affording her one final window for a flight response. Instead, Vivian demonstrates a profound cognitive breakthrough. She stabilizes her hands, realizing that chronic evasion guarantees perpetual victimization. Ethan fades into the periphery to document the ambush. Lucian adjusts his attire with predatory fluidity, issuing a strict directive to remain close. We must internalize this mechanism. When trauma demands entry, retreating only feeds the pathology. You must firmly anchor yourself. The atmospheric pressure shifts, mimicking a high-stress interrogation cell. Picture this observation with me. Vivian performs a self-soothing gesture. She elevates her chin, neurologically bracing for impact, murmuring acceptance that her previous reality is incinerated. Lucian exhibits a micro-expression of sociopathic approval. He advances with the fluidity of an individual habituated to violence, eliminating the physical barrier. Damien commands the visual field, his ocular tracking locking onto Vivian. A flash of cognitive dissonance registers before his musculature hardens into a mask of calculated malice. A synthetic honeyed smile materializes as he vocalizes her name. Heed this warning. Never misinterpret the superficial charm of a malignant narcissist who engineered your destruction. Let us open this clinical file by examining the exact moment of a psychological fracture. Damien stands in the doorway, a textbook megalomaniac attempting to reassert dominance over the victim whose reality he just dismantled. He tries to warp the narrative, classifying his betrayal with her sister as a simple misunderstanding. This is classic gaslighting. Yet Vivian does not retreat into the dark of submission. She anchors herself beside Lucien, stepping forward. Her voice is barely a whisper, but it shatters his pathological excuse instantly. You must remember this critical lesson in survival. Never allow the architect of your trauma to rewrite the history of your pain. A bead of cold sweat betrays Damien. His jaw clenches as his hired muscle watches his total loss of control. Notice how quickly a narcissist's facade crumbles when their authority is challenged. Lucian drops his voice to a lethal, flat register, ordering the man away. That single boundary entirely fractures Damien's fragile, inflated ego. He lunges, but Lucian blocks him with the calculated speed of an apex predator. Genuine panic bleeds into Damien's eyes. He begins screaming about their corporate merger, clinging to the sociopathic delusion that currency can repair a mutilated psyche. Then, Vivian delivers the fatal psychological blow. Maintaining unbroken eye contact, she weaponizes his vile affair with her sister against him. The clinical takeaway here is vital. Never let an abuser manipulate you into feeling remorse for escaping their control. Cornered, Damien violently plays the victim. A jagged, defensive laugh tears from Damien's throat as he attempts to plant new seeds of cognitive dissonance. He mocks her desperation for a safe harbor, spitting that Lucian views her only as a disposable pawn. Yet Vivian displays remarkable emotional regulation, refusing to flinch. She clinically dissects his threat, declaring that being a pawn is vastly superior to being psychologically butchered by a supposed protector. The words strike him physically. His face flushes red with narcissistic rage as he screams about a $40 million deal. She calmly states she is entirely finished being traded, like a depreciating asset. We must internalize this truth. A quiet, stable peace will always hold more value than a toxic, chaotic empire. Damien can only spit a final 24-hour threat. Lucian offers a lethal, measured smile, softly advising the erratic megalomaniac to retreat before the damage becomes irreversible. Stick with me as we analyze this scene, because the underlying threat of violence is incredibly thick. Damien finally perceives the genuine danger, stepping back and hissing a promise of impending war. Vivian stares into the void, whispering that the conflict has already ended. The sedan speeds into the night, but observe her behavioral shift the absolute second that heavy door clicks shut. The survival facade shatters. Vivian slides down the wall, her nervous system overloading as the adrenaline evacuates her bloodstream. This highlights a fundamental psychological truth. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand firm while deeply terrified. Before her knees impact the floor, Lucian physically intercepts her. His deep voice serves as a grounding anchor for her dysregulated nervous system, methodically commanding her to breathe. As the adrenaline recedes, a clinical exhaustion takes its place. She notices the jagged scar along his jaw, a haunting diagnostic marker of a man forged in genuine bloodshed. Survivor's guilt immediately blooms in her chest, terrified that collateral damage will result from her psychological trauma. Yet Lucian remains stoic. He quietly confesses his ongoing 3-year campaign to systematically dismantle Damien's enterprise. He offers her a safe flight away. Remember this reality. Genuine bravery is choosing the battlefield when the exit is wide open. She rejects the escape, swearing to see the conflict end. The housekeeper eases the traumatized woman onto the leather sofa, placing warm tea into her trembling hands to combat the physiological shock. By the window, Lucian's silhouette cuts a dark shape. He outlines the enemy's probable next move, noting Damien is contacting her father to freeze her assets and initiate a smear campaign. Vivian closes her eyes, whispering a quiet acceptance. Lucian cautions that rival factions will now target him purely to amplify her psychological suffering. Slowly, she lowers the porcelain cup. When her eyes open again, the victim mentality is gone, replaced by a cold, aggressive resilience. Carry this clinical lesson with you. You truly meet your strongest self only when a predator tries to burn your world to ash. Ethan laughs softly from the hallway. Ethan chuckles, noting her sudden behavioral shift and suggesting she remain a permanent fixture. In their volatile ecosystem, unconditioned loyalty is a statistical anomaly. He asks his brother if their tactical posture is defensive or a direct, lethal strike. Lucian answers by dialing a shadow contact. His tone is devoid of affect as he demands the buried data on the Torres merger, the offshore ledgers, and decades of financial pathology. Vivian watches, completely paralyzed. Lucian is engineering a systematic eradication of Damien's power base, revealing the entire empire is merely a fraudulent, narcissistic illusion. Keep this clinical truth close. The taller a sociopath stacks their monument of lies, the more thoroughly it shatters when finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. You and I are about to witness the precise cognitive pivot where a traumatized survivor weaponizes her own grief. Vivian asks the critical question that alters her psychological trajectory. Will exposing this massive fraud annihilate her own family's legacy? Lucian maintains direct eye contact and softly confirms the collateral damage. Then, the profound shift occurs. Her fine motor tremors completely cease. She verbally commands them to burn the entire structure to the ground. Ethan displays a predatory, antisocial grin. Lucian probes to see if she is cognitively prepared for the severe fallout. Vivian's response is pure emotional detachment. Her biological family commodified her for a profit margin. Never underestimate the danger of a shattered mind that finally refuses the victim role. As the decrypted files hit the servers, the forensic evidence is staggering. Let us examine the pathology here together. Vivian reviews physical records while the brothers dissect the drives. Every falsified ledger represents another behavioral failure from Damien. Honestly, the psychological knife twists with brutal precision when Vivian identifies her own father's signature on the illicit contracts. Her family actively facilitated this corruption. Lucian clinically explains the dark triad traits common among the elite. They display their worst sins openly, relying entirely on the collective bystander effect. Suddenly, Ethan uncovers proof that Damien has been actively embezzling from his own ruthless father. The lesson is absolute. Arrogant, malignant greed always leaves a traceable paper trail. Lucian observes the offshore transfers illuminating the monitors, portraying a cold, predatory satisfaction. Greed and low impulse control formulate a lethal cocktail, he murmurs. Vivian demands to analyze the architecture of their retaliation. Lucian is strategically severing the pathological bond between Damien and his violently narcissistic father. Once the older sociopath realizes his offspring has been financially bleeding him, the retaliation will be absolute. As they chart this ruin, Vivian's phone vibrates. Her enabler mother is begging her to return to the toxic family dynamic. Vivian clinically deletes the manipulation without a single physical flinch. Remember this necessary truth. To effectively heal a deep psychological trauma, you must stop answering the door when the knife knocks. The cognitive burden of betrayal rarely rests. Vivian's screen illuminates, displaying a message from her sister, the secondary architect of her trauma. She is begging for dialogue, attempting to re-establish the severed trauma bond. Vivian's micro-expressions harden into absolute indifference as she permanently blocks the contact. Detaching from a toxic familial unit is an agonizing yet necessary step toward emotional regulation. Seconds later, an anonymous number delivers a graphic, violent threat. Lucian analyzes the text, his demeanor turning remarkably cold. He notes that narcissistic collapse breeds fatal behavioral errors, immediately assigning a covert operative to shadow her. Remember, a sociopath rapidly losing their absolute control is the most profoundly dangerous animal in the room. Lucian interrupts her protest, establishing a firm psychological boundary. He declares her physical security is now his sole operational burden. Usually, such territorial behavior indicates a possessive pathology. Yet, for Vivian, his hypervigilance functions as an essential fortress. Ethan attempts to diffuse the heavy tension with dark humor while hacking the servers. Lucian ignores the deflection, commanding him to trace the financial anomalies. Take note of this simple reality. Meticulous monsters always leave a diagnostic trail for those brave enough to look. Hours bleed away in that study as they forge a weaponized profile against their mutual enemy. Then the quiet atmosphere suddenly shatters. Her phone vibrates against the mahogany wood. It is her father, the primary, original architect of her complex lifelong trauma. Let us examine the subject together, observing her initial break from deep conditioning. Lucian remains in the periphery, noting the psychological chessboard is finally hers. Vivian activates the speaker with a trembling hand. The patriarch's freezing voice instantly alters the room's baseline atmosphere, a classic tactic of a megalomaniac narcissist demanding compliance. She rejects the command. Recognizing his loss of control, the father pivots to weaponized guilt, citing the optics of her defection. This acute stressor fractures Vivian's psychological dam. She states he commodified her, auctioning his own genetics to a predator. The patriarch immediately adopts the victim role, claiming he only sought her security, but the cognitive dissonance is shattered. She recognizes he nourished his empire with her distress. The clinical lesson is simple. If an individual only values your utility in elevating their own status, their affection is merely a manipulation tactic. Vivian violently dismantles the familial illusion. She asserts his sole motivation was consolidating empires, ignoring Damien's sociopathic pathology. Her father commands her to regulate her volume. She refuses presenting the raw data. Damien was sleeping with her sister, and her primary caregivers were entirely complicit. The static silence on the line confirms this betrayal. The patriarch minimizes the trauma as a mere distraction, proving his empire supersedes human attachment. Vivian emits a deregulated, hollow laugh. She advises him to select another human variable as she is withdrawing from his behavioral loop. He threatens total financial severing. The psychological lesson here is critical. When someone proves they prioritize their wealth over your basic emotional survival, you must believe their baseline actions over their words. You and I have likely observed a psychological precipice like this. That financial threat was engineered to trigger regression, but it shatters her conditioning instead. She tells her father to keep his capital, preferring biological survival over wealthy captivity. The patriarch warns of her cognitive error. She counters by targeting his core pathology. Her miscalculation was projecting empathy onto a man who solely loves his assets. She terminates the connection, dropping the device like a biological contaminant. Ethan silently observes the total extinction of her Stockholm syndrome. Vivian experiences a massive physiological release, bursting into a deregulated, breathless laugh. Reclaiming autonomy from an abuser is entirely terrifying, but securing your mental baseline is always worth the severe initial shock of the fall. Vivian regulates her respiration, collapsing as she admits her unstable baseline, though cognitive freedom overrides her grief. Lucian eliminates the distance, acting as a protective barrier. He analyzes her fatigue and issues a clinical correction. She is not destitute because his asset pool is limitless. He frames this not as charity, but as calculated behavioral warfare. Her family anticipates a regression without funds, so they will starve that expectation. Vivian assesses him, asking why he would risk his empire for her. His muscular tension decreases, exposing a deep psychological scar. No one intervened during his own profound isolation. The clinical lesson here is simple. Assisting someone in surviving the exact systemic abuse that once fractured your own psyche is the most highly evolved defense mechanism a human can possibly possess. Before she can process his trauma disclosure, the hacker's hardware emits a sharp alert. Ethan's biological response is immediate. Blood drains from his face as he isolates an intercepted data packet from Damien. The sociopathic ex-partner has initiated an emergency board assembly. The core psychological threat is embedded in the subject line, demanding an acute psychiatric evaluation of Vivian's cognitive stability. Her physiological temperature plummets. Damien is constructing a mass gaslighting campaign, labeling her as unstable to manipulate the merger. Worse, her father will adopt the persona of a distressed caregiver. Ethan analyzes the remaining data, his tone heavy with dread as he identifies secondary layers to the trap. The behavioral lesson is quite mandatory. The most lethal psychological poisons are consistently hidden quietly within the very smallest administrative details. Let us dissect the sociopathic calculus of this methodology. Damien is importing a compromised psychiatrist to pathologize Vivian's normal trauma responses. Lucian deconstructs the narcissist's endgame. Once that fabricated diagnosis enters the institutional record, her credibility is permanently neutralized. A panic response activates in Vivian's chest as she realizes these men are overwriting her identity to protect their capital. The psychological mandate is absolute. Never surrender narrative control of your own cognitive reality. Exhibiting tremors, she questions how to dismantle such an institutional leviathan. Lucian's baseline remains entirely flat. He requisitions a predatory litigator. Displaying a cold micro-expression, he outlines the counter-offensive. They will enter that boardroom and present empirical data to systematically annihilate Damien's entire legacy. Lucian adopts the template of a tactical commander, instructing her to submit every suppressed data point into the permanent log. Vivian exhibits tremors, fearing these narcissists will dismantle her. Lucian neutralizes her amygdala response. If they gaslight her sanity for escaping a predator, he states, "We will evaluate their sanity for expecting her to remain captive." This exact interval marks the extinction of Vivian's trauma conditioning. Her acute panic reorganizes into a concentrated, cognitive hostility. She informs Lucian she intends to reduce the abuser's empire to carbon. The behavioral imperative is clear. Aligning with individuals who reinforce your neurological resilience rather than your fear is essential for survival. Lucian prescribes a sleep cycle, but Ethan's vocalization of pure terror suddenly interrupts. What other pathological variables remain hidden? Let us evaluate the shifting psychological hierarchy. Ethan observes Vivian with reverence and acute sympathetic arousal, noting she is the first variable to establish a boundary against an apex predator. Yet, he pleads that this malignant warfare not consume her empathetic baseline. Vivian maintains a dissociative affect publicly, but upon retreating to her quarters, her compartmentalization fails. Her respiratory rhythm fractures. She is no longer merely extinguishing a trauma bond. She is initiating a systemic eradication of her entire conditioning history. Tomorrow, she must dismantle every figure who induced her learned helplessness. A severe clinical reality must be acknowledged. Periodically, a subject must actively incinerate the compliant, heavily conditioned iteration of their ego to acquire true psychological autonomy. The acoustic trigger of the door engages. Vivian identifies Lucian's locomotive cadence, integrating it into her neurological safety baseline. He leans against the frame, inquiring if the echoes of her trauma are inducing insomnia. She utilizes a classic self-soothing mechanism, verbalizing her anticipatory anxiety. Lucian's presentation shifts from an enforcer to a subject highly familiar with psychological distress. He refuses to apply palliative cognitive distortions, forecasting that Damien will utilize deregulated aggression to shatter her ego stability. Vivian subconsciously seeks a soothing response, but Lucian provides a weaponized behavioral framework. He instructs her to cease projecting normative ethics onto clinical psychopaths, anticipate a hostile environment, and escalate the punitive response. The psychological axiom is fundamental. You cannot expect malignant entities to adhere to the social contract merely because your own empathy centers are entirely intact. Let us examine this specific analytical frame together. The illumination exhibits Lucian's facial tension as he establishes an optical lock with Vivienne, dismantling her remaining cognitive distortions. He dictates that her objective is not submissive negotiation, but triggering the systemic collapse of their predatory ecosystem. A sympathetic response activates in her chest, though she verbalizes the amygdala hijack, paralyzing her motor functions. Lucian reduces the spatial distance. Fear, he hypothesizes, is an adaptive evolutionary mechanism, maintaining the acute vigilance required for survival. When she interrogates his intrinsic motivation, his rigid defensive posture decompensates. He possesses empirical knowledge of the psychological deformation required to weaponize a human. The clinical observation is profound. The most fragmented psyches consistently hemorrhage the most emotional labor to insulate other subjects from identical traumatic conditioning. Lucian's fortified ego structures undergo a controlled demolition. He exhibits chronic fatigue, displaying an absolute intolerance for observing naive subjects, become acceptable losses in psychopathic games. When Vivian engages in classic victim blaming, issuing a self-indictment for missing the behavioral markers, Lucian interrupts her rumination loop. He clinically notes she was immobilized by the most rudimentary grooming tactic in the abuser's methodology. The illumination decreases as he unlocks the repressed memory vault of his foundational trauma. For 15 years, he observed his paternal figure enact a systematic psychological annihilation of his maternal figure, while society misattributed the pathology to the victim. She expired internalizing those toxic projections. The unhealed microfractures in his respiration are audible as he issues a behavioral absolute. The psychiatric imperative is critical. Never permit a malignant personality to overwrite your cognitive baseline, nor accept their pathology as your burden. Let us examine this clinical file together. We observe Vivian caught in a textbook trauma bond. She clearly recognizes the lethal pathology of the syndicate boss beside her, yet her limbic system overrides all rational logic. She leans directly into the danger. Then, an external stimulus fractures their shared delusion. His phone signals a perimeter breach. Instantaneously, his psyche compartmentalizes, replacing the tender facade with a highly functioning sociopath. He issues rapid commands and abandons her in isolation. The ensuing silence is deafening, interrupted only by her screen illuminating with an unknown number. Behaviorally speaking, this illustrates a harsh reality. When severing ties with a malignant narcissist, they will relentlessly attempt to breach your psychological defenses. True recovery requires logging the door and never looking back. The message she receives is textbook coercive control. Return immediately, or else her physical tremors indicate an acute stress response. Before she can seek Lucian's intervention, splintering wood and shattering glass signal a violent home invasion. Approaching the threshold, she monitors Lucian's vocal fluctuations. He speaks rapid Korean, his affect entirely blunted, characteristic of an antisocial personality in combat. Her device vibrates again. It is him, exhibiting a terrifyingly flat tone despite the ambient violence. An assassination squad is present. He orders her to maintain concealment. Her nervous system screams for flight, yet a profound cognitive restructuring occurs within her mind. Evading a predator may prolong physical survival, but true psychological emancipation demands confronting your darkest terrors directly. We observe a fascinating shift from a freeze response to active aggression. She grips a heavy marble bookend, converting a mundane object into a tool for self-preservation. The scene below provides staggering behavioral data. 3 hostile operatives kneel in submission, neutralized by Lucian's organized syndicate. An associate documents the psychological degradation from the corner, while the domestic staff brandishes a lethal kitchen blade, demonstrating extreme pack loyalty. At the epicenter stands Lucian. He presses his weapon into the primary target's skull, displaying complete emotional detachment. He allots the operative 5 seconds to justify his continued existence. The clinical takeaway here is striking. Never underestimate the latent aggression of those embedded in your support system, for their capacity to execute absolute violence in your defense is utterly boundless. Let us pause and evaluate this behavioral sample together. This is a masterful display of psychological domination. The neutralized operative attempts a defense mechanism of grandiosity, loudly demanding files through threats. Lucian exhibits zero autonomic arousal. He maintains a flattened affect, softly stating the files were acquired legally. The environmental tension is absolute. Lucian invades the subject's intimate space, whispering his true identity. He methodically dissects the man's psychological profile, a disgraced combatant executing violent acts for minimal compensation. He highlights the subject's severe social isolation, noting that his disappearance would trigger zero grief. We learn a critical principle here. Authentic psychological supremacy requires absolutely no volume, and weaponizing an adversary's deepest insecurities will always guarantee total behavioral compliance, secures verbal confirmation of claims, and the subjects are removed. We then witness a rare destabilization in his pathology. Upon spotting Vivian's silhouette, her white-knuckled grip on the stone indicates a hyper-aroused state. Instantly, his sociopathic compartmentalization fails. Acute panic floods his nervous system. He breaches her proximity rapidly, his voice straining as he reprimands her exposure to lethal variables. Vivian grounds herself, demonstrating remarkable ego strength. She outright refuses to remain a passive victim while he absorbs physical trauma on her behalf. Stripped of his defensive grandiosity, he labels her clinically insane. She instantly mirrors the diagnosis, identifying his own deep psychological fractures. The most resilient interpersonal attachments are forged when two individuals willingly endure catastrophic Furchtbüchse for one another. He verbally diminishes his own biological worth, a classic symptom of internalized chronic trauma. This cognition triggers a sharp emotional response in Vivian. She closes the physical distance, aggressively challenging his distorted self-perception. Experiencing post-adrenaline tremors, she lists the dependent individuals tethered to his existence. The acoustic environment flatlines. Two subjects, both harboring severe attachment injuries, stabilize after an extreme threat. She articulates a profound vulnerability, stating his life holds immense value to her. Lucian initiates tactile contact, his gentle motor control entirely betraying his violent history. He issues a boundary warning, predicting catastrophic outcomes. Yet, Vivian leans into the stimulus. Maintaining avoidant behaviors may preserve vital signs, but embracing profound psychological risk is the sole catalyst for genuine vitality. Her repressed emotional reservoirs finally rupture. She verbalizes her history of chronic subjugation, sacrificing her ego for a dysfunctional family system and enabling an inadequate partner. Her ocular microexpressions indicate a surge of aggressive self-actualization. She rejects her designated role as a compliant victim. When Lucian probes her core identity formulation, she declares her intent to construct her new self in his proximity. Lucian's rigid defense mechanisms instantaneously disintegrate. Vivian initiates physical contact, overriding her own threat avoidance pathways. He momentarily exhibits a freeze response before his primal, deprived attachment needs violently activate. The interaction is chaotic, aggressive, and saturated with chronic emotional starvation. Severing the neurological chains of past subjugation is the necessary prerequisite for locating a partner who truly aligns with your darkest internal pathology. Let us analyze this critical juncture together. The chronic social isolation they have both endured reaches an explosive climax. Vivian utilizes him as a somatic anchor, regulating her erratic heart rate against his musculature. Upon separating, Lucian initiates frontal lobe proximity, resting his forehead against hers. He articulates the irreversible nature of this behavioral transgression. Her response indicates a complete dismantling of her previous moral framework. She expresses a desire for total destruction. He provides a reality check, noting that Damien's narcissistic rage will perceive this as a declaration of warfare. Yet, rather than manifesting clinical anxiety, she experiences a surge of euphoric dopamine. The data proves that the most anxiety-inducing behavioral deviations are frequently the exact interventions required to permanently dismantle the psychological cages we build for ourselves. Maintaining sustained eye contact with a lethal personality, she verbalizes absolute cognitive certainty. We observe the survival-oriented loops re-engaging within his prefrontal cortex. He deliberately disengages, reapplying his impenetrable sociopathic exterior. He issues a directive for sleep, citing the impending systemic conflict. She responds with a defensive, sarcastic vocalization, prompting an involuntary micro-expression of amusement on his features. He clinically analyzes her illogical decision to engage an armed threat with a stationary object. Isolated in her quarters, her sympathetic nervous system finally deactivates. The sudden drop in cortisol leaves her physically compromised against the structural barrier. She mentally processes the catastrophic variables she just embraced. Taking ownership of a chaotic trajectory will always prove psychologically superior to functioning as a depersonalized, hollow entity. Her decision stems from a repressed survival drive aggressively overriding her learned helplessness. Following a deep REM cycle, environmental stimuli jar her awake. The domestic enforcer provides caffeine paired with an authoritative directive. The thermal shock of the water removes the chemical residue of violence and the tactile memory of their chaotic bonding. Donning a meticulously structured charcoal garment, Vivienne engages in self-evaluation. She experiences a productive dissociation. The reflection presents a fully armored, emotionally detached operator. Downstairs, the domestic space is now a tactical command center, populated by cyber specialists and covert agents. This provides a crucial therapeutic insight. Constructing your own psychological plating and assuming an aggressive posture is the ultimate intervention when moving to annihilate those who engineered your trauma. Step into this clinical observation space with me. The atmospheric tension registers as psychologically sterile. Lucian exhibits the suppressed kinetic energy of an apex threat, wrapped in aggressive attire. His mandibular tension is rigid, yet his ocular focus betrays his retention of her midnight vulnerability. He introduces his highly specialized fixers. We observe Rachel Kim displaying the classic sociopathic charm of a corporate litigator, and David Chen presenting a flat lethal affect. Rachel maintains unblinking predatory eye contact, outlining a strategy to dismantle Damien via catastrophic financial litigation. David commits to suppressing any public diagnostic labels, questioning Vivienne's sanity. Observe this operational truth. When malignant actors attempt to systematically assassinate your character, you must recruit specialized apex predators capable of executing a ruthless, devastating defense. David establishes a legal boundary, noting the opposing medical professional lacks diagnostic authority. His clinical assessment is transactional and void. Despite this logical reassurance, Vivienne displays fine motor tremors. This somatic symptom indicates a deep-seated phobia of social annihilation. A new operative, Marcus, emerges from the periphery, demonstrating the blunted trauma of combat experience. He recommends weaponizing the adversary's disinformation. They will execute a cognitive reframe, exposing Damien's narcissistic obsession and proving he orchestrated her mental decline to obscure his fraud. Vivienne verbalizes a fear of the impending collateral damage. Lucian's vocal register lowers, clinically stating the pathology is already present. They are merely applying illumination to the infection. Facing the absolute center of your trauma permanently destroys its psychological authority over your actions. Rachel retreats into the shadows, a subtle nod confirming the operation has begun. Vivian is no longer seeking pathological validation. She is executing a strike to reclaim her cognitive sovereignty. The final directive is clear. She must refuse to let Damien manipulate her nervous system. As they enter the convoy, Lucian anchors himself beside her. The black vehicles dagger the Miami streets like apex predators. In the quiet, Vivian admits her paralyzing terror. A clinical smirk touches Lucian's lips in the passing lights. He recontextualizes her panic, explaining that fear is a biological necessity. Never let anyone convince you that experiencing terror equates to inherent weakness. Fear is simply your mind's primitive alarm bell, forcing you to remain hypervigilant so you can survive the predators circling your life. Let us examine this dynamic together. Lucian's tone is a calculated low frequency, instructing her not to shrink into a defensive posture. She must cross that threshold not as a victim, but as a dominant equal. When hyperventilation threatens, he initiates grounding contact, brushing her hand to reset her nervous system. They arrive at the glass structure, a monument to her abuser's megalomania, with his name etched in steel. The elevator ride mimics a psychological descent into the darkest parts of the human mind. Her legal team forms a barrier, while Lucian maintains a deliberate position one pace behind her. Notice the clinical beauty of this stance. Genuine loyalty does not require fighting a war for another person. It requires standing firmly in their blind spot, providing enough borrowed stability so they can find the strength to save themselves. The receptionist exhibits an immediate stress response as the group enters. She attempts a delay, but Lucian deploys a stare that triggers her paralysis instinct. The doors open to reveal the pathogenic family unit, her compromised father, the domineering patriarch, and the betrayer. Damien initially projects classic narcissistic superiority. The millisecond he registers the hostile legal squad, his grandiose delusion fractures. We witness a flash of panic before he desperately reassembles his charismatic mask. He fabricates a laugh, employing gaslighting by claiming he is glad she is rational again. Vivian maintains prolonged eye contact, utilizing a flat affect as she rejects his narrative. Observe this behavioral reality carefully. Do not mistake a person's sudden silence for total submission. They are likely just utilizing that quiet time in the shadows to meticulously orchestrate their own absolute liberation. You and I have analyzed this specific pathology before. Vivian drops her bag onto the desk, an auditory shock disrupting their perceived authority. Damien's father feigns concern for her cognitive stability. This attempt to pathologize her fails entirely. Vivian verbally dissects his framework, forcing the clinical reality into the open. Discovering severe betrayal is not a psychotic break. Her anger is the only functional response to profound trauma. Damien exhibits fine motor tremors, his nervous system flooded with cortisol as he begs to contain the damage. Vivian's gaze turns clinically detached. She declares their right to discretion vanished the moment they attempted to break her mind. Recognize this vital defense mechanism. When abusers attempt to smother you in fabricated guilt, speaking the undeniable truth aloud is the only way to ensure your psychological survival. In psychiatric terms, Vivian shifts from emotional distress to instrumental aggression. She systematically dismantles her abusers, listing Damien's covert e.g., the illicit offshore accounts and diverted assets. The patriarch's facial muscles tighten, his arrogant expressions evaporating, as Damien uses the desperate defense mechanism of calling her delusional. Rachel slides the physical evidence forward. The heavy thud of fraudulent invoices acts as a definitive psychological blow. It is a documented pathway to federal prison. Damien experiences a massive stress response, blood draining from his face as his false reality collapses. When he frantically projects blame, Rachel merely smiles and offers to contact the authorities. The behavioral takeaway is clear. If you plan to launch an attack on another human being, you must first ensure your own life contains no fatal vulnerabilities. Damien undergoes a catastrophic collapse of his narcissistic supply, vocalizing fragmented justifications. Yet the ultimate blow originates from his own pathogenic family. His father's tone lacks any trace of paternal attachment. It is purely transactional rage over stolen resources. Damien attempts to reframe his crimes as ambition, but the patriarch's gaze holds only disgust. It is a narcissist discarding a failed extension of himself. Vivian remains clinically detached. In a frantic bid to preserve status, Vivian's biological father intervenes, prioritizing corporate metrics over his daughter's trauma. Vivian shifts her focus to her primary betrayer. She presents the very contract he weaponized against her and legally nullifies it, detonating their financial future. Consider this profound truth. The precise structures an abuser builds to imprison your mind often contain the exact loopholes required to guarantee your absolute emancipation. Let us step back and analyze the systemic failure within this space. Vivian highlights the contractual escape clause, neutralizing their control entirely. Observe the physiological reaction of Vivian's father. His blood pressure spikes dangerously as his perceived legacy evaporates. Vivian's response is a psychiatric masterclass in cognitive distancing. She refuses to fuse her identity with a parasitic entity merely to sustain her father's grandiose delusions. Antonio operates with Machiavellian coldness, permanently severing his attachment to Damien, who retreats in total submission. The surrounding stakeholders, recognizing the organizational necrosis, immediately withdraw their resources. I have analyzed dozens of identical structural failures. You cannot sustain a life built entirely on psychological manipulation. It only requires a single point of unyielding truth to trigger a total, devastating collapse. The environment depopulates, creating a sensory vacuum typical of isolated trauma zones. Antonio assesses Vivian's stability with clinical interest, forecasting the retaliatory violence she just invited. Notice her complete lack of a startle response. She articulates a profound psychological breakthrough. The predators were always present. She simply stopped enabling them. Antonio withdraws. She is now isolated with the parental figure who commodified her existence. Staring at the financial ruins, he deploys one final attempt to induce unwarranted guilt. Vivian definitively severs the trauma bond. She quietly states that their family unit perished the exact moment he assigned a monetary value to his offspring. Examine this behavioral milestone. You must never allow another human being to calculate your intrinsic value, especially the ones who share your genetic sequence. She exits completely unburdened. Vivian projects a final gaze upon her primary caregiver, noting she retains her psychological integrity, an asset his pathology cannot comprehend. She exits, initiating a massive shift in power dynamics. Inside the elevator, the collective adrenaline surge peaks. Rachel processes the survival high through dark laughter. Marcus executes the digital strike, disseminating the compromising data to the media. As the adrenaline drops, Vivian grounds her forehead against the freezing steel, questioning the severe emotional dysregulation of their survival. Rachel validates her, noting that dismantling a corrupt system always generates immense turbulence. Absorb this clinical reality, initiating a direct confrontation with the people who systematically broke your mind is the most destabilizing, yet absolutely essential action you can take to reclaim your existence. Down below, Jin waits in the shadows. The unit rapidly extracts into the transport. Observe the instantaneous collapse of Vivian's muscular rigidity. With the threat neutralized, her nervous system crashes into a state of profound exhaustion. She leans into Lucian. You and I have studied this specific physiological depletion in trauma survivors. When he assesses her status, she is incapable of speech, communicating only a need for quiet. He establishes physical contact to stabilize her. However, this fragile equilibrium is violently interrupted by Jean. A hostile vehicle is mirroring their vector through the flooded streets. Lucian's musculature instantly hardens. He recognizes the behavioral signature. This is an overt intimidation tactic designed to induce learned helplessness. Never forget this behavioral law. The exact second you finally disrupt a toxic system, the parasitic elements will aggressively escalate their efforts to drag you back into the dark. Acute hyperarousal floods Vivian's nervous system. Yet, Lucian deliberately modulates his vocal frequency, clinically noting that a public attack is statistically improbable. Despite this reassurance, the visual presence of his concealed firearm highlights the genuine danger. He issues a tactical command, plunging their vehicle into the disorienting glare of a subterranean structure. They endure a suffocating silence until the hostile entity bypasses them. Relocated to their elevated secure facility, the isolation mimics a psychological quarantine. The team immediately begins weaponizing the data. Vivian isolates herself by the glass, observing her dissociated reflection against the sprawling city. She has successfully dismantled her fabricated reality, retained this vital psychological principle. In highly toxic environments, you must deliberately incinerate the entire framework of your past simply to illuminate a viable path forward. Let us open this case file together and examine the pathology at play. Vivian expected closure, but instead suffers an acute trauma response, visceral nausea. Across the room, Lucian raises his phone. The screen illuminates a terrifying mask of predatory rage settling over his features. He severs the call, leaving a suffocating, clinical silence. The predator hunting them is no stranger. It is her own father's private security. The man who shares her genetics is actively engineering her execution. Marcus decodes the ledgers, projecting forensic evidence of massive blood money flowing to the Torres syndicate. The betrayal represents a complete psychological fracture. We must confront a very dark behavioral truth here. The most dangerous psychopaths rarely lurk in dark alleys. They are the ones smiling warmly at you across the family dinner table. The data is staggering. $200,000 bleeds from her father's accounts every month. Rachel identifies the pathology immediately: textbook extortion. Vivian experiences severe cognitive dissonance, desperate to deny reality, but the receipts form an airtight timeline. Lucian then delivers the psychological kill shot. Marcus traced the dates. The blackmail began exactly 2 weeks after Ethan was arrested. Ethan freezes in pure autonomic shock. Vivian's father was the silent architect of his destruction, sacrificing the boy to secure his own business contracts. Remember this fundamental rule of human behavior. Pathological deception always leaves a trail. No matter how much wealth is burned to hide it, the reality hits Vivian so violently, her motor functions fail, forcing her to grip the windowsill. Vivian whispers it must be an error, but the truth is taking root. Her brain frantically recontextualizes her past, analyzing his previous behaviors, the forced corporate mergers, his panic when she asserted independence. He was never a protective patriarch. He was a narcissist buying his survival from the underworld. Lucian reaches out, but Vivian recoils. Sickened by the perceived corruption in her own genetics, she barricades herself in the bathroom, collapsing onto the tile. We all reach a clinical breaking point where the only healthy response is to completely shatter. She weeps until the trauma hollows her out, leaving only freezing rage. A soft knock echoes. Lucian slides down the wall, outside. He offers no empty platitudes, simply sharing the suffocating silence of her psychological collapse. Let us analyze this psychological freefall together. Vivian whispers that her entire reality is built on a pathological lie. But Lucian acts as an anchor, refusing to let her dissociate. He states the fraud belongs entirely to her father, a man who destroyed Ethan and used his daughter to mask his sociopathic crimes. Vivian exhibits classic self-blame, hating herself for missing the behavioral cues. Lucian interrupts this destructive spiral. Expecting affection from a primary caregiver does not make you foolish, he reminds her. It simply makes you human. He clinically admits his desire to watch her father's empire burn, but vows to shield her from the fallout. We cannot control the severe pathologies of those who raised us, but we always retain the psychological agency to rebuild our lives from their wreckage. Lucian's hardened armor softens for a micro-expression, revealing a rare psychological crack. He validates Vivian's resilience. Most subjects would dissociate under this trauma, but her survival drive fights the current. Processing her father's betrayal, she coldly asks for their next tactical maneuver. Lucian promises to drag every suppressed secret into the light. He guarantees Antonio and her father will face systemic collapse, asking if she wants to witness the destruction. She steadily replies that she wants to watch them burn. Remember this behavioral truth. Sometimes vengeance is merely justice wearing a much darker suit. But right as their trauma bond solidifies, Rachel shatters the clinical atmosphere. Antonio just executed a manipulative countermeasure, hitting Lucian with a brutal restraining order. Appreciate the sociopathic audacity of this maneuver. The hearing is before Judge Morrison, an asset Antonio financially compromised years ago. Rachel clinically identifies this as a tactic to bury the forensic evidence. David warns that exposing the conspiracy now guarantees their own incarceration. Ethan vibrates with helpless, autonomic rage. But in the corner, Marcus lets out a quiet, pathological laugh. He taps his screen, revealing a beautiful structural weakness. Chen, the brutal enforcer who attacked them, is actually Antonio's nephew. Marcus recovered the deleted server data. Years of digital footprints prove Chen directly manages the extortion operation. The psychological lesson here is quite poetic. The dark's secrets corrupt men weaponize to build their fragile empires are always the exact instruments of their undoing. Observe the behavioral shift in this room. Vivian experiences cognitive vertigo, stunned by the scale of the narcissistic empire they unearthed. Marcus reveals Chen's encrypted fortress was compromised 6 months ago. The blood money sits in plain sight. Ethan operates on pure amygdala response, demanding Chen's immediate arrest. But Lucian operates with cold, prefrontal clarity, his eyes locked onto the monitor like a tactician, mapping a massacre. They will not delegate survival to a compromised legal system. They are detonating this data tonight and flooding the press before Antonio can mount a defense. Rachel casts a sorrowful glance at Vivienne. Understanding this permanently erases her father's legacy. It reminds us of a clinical absolute. Sometimes, to eradicate a deeply rooted parasite, you simply must burn the entire host to the ground. Rachel clinically warns Vivienne, this protocol guarantees complete financial execution. There is no reversing the damage. But Vivienne's mind is fixated on her father's narcissistic smirk, his absolute lack of empathy as he crushed innocent lives. Her features harden into an emotionless mask. She issues the command without a single physiological tremor. Marcus transmits the encrypted data to federal agencies and journalists. A suffocating silence swallows the room. Soon, untouchable sociopaths will watch their empires disintegrate. Vivienne experiences a terrifying, dissociated calm. Yet Rachel understands the behavioral reality, knowing cornered predators execute their most violent strikes when trapped. Right on cue, Lucian's secure phone shatters the quiet with a screaming threat alarm. It reinforces a critical biological lesson. The exact moment you permanently corner a monster is the moment you force it to bare its teeth. As the alarm screams, Vivienne demands answers. Lucian's usually controlled prefrontal cortex is flooded with panic. His estate's perimeter defenses have been breached, leaving only Ethan and Mrs. Kwan inside the kill zone. The room erupts into a tactical response. Weapons are racked as they sprint for the garage. Jen pushes the armored transport to its limits, tearing through the city. Lucian barks commands into the radio, attempting to outmaneuver tragedy. Vivienne clings to the door, her nervous system braced for impact. The tires scream up the driveway, but the atmospheric silence feels deeply wrong. Headlights wash over the steps, revealing a horrific visual. The reinforced doors are shattered, and fresh blood paints the white marble. It is a harsh, psychological reminder. The fortified sanctuaries we construct to protect our vulnerabilities are often the most fragile structures of all. The transport is still moving when Lucian forces his door open. He charges up the steps, weapon raised, transitioning entirely into a lethal combat state. Rachel forces Vivienne down, ordering her to stay out of the active crossfire. 2 sharp gunshots shatter the air. Enduring that sensory deprivation in the dark is its own form of psychological torture. Driven by raw adrenaline, Vivienne rips herself free and runs blindly inside. The grand foyer is a chaotic scene of destruction. In the center sits Mrs. Kwan, hemorrhaging heavily. But it is the limp body cradled in her arms that induces a complete cognitive shutdown. Ethan, Lucian collapses, his hands frantically applying chest compressions, his fractured voice screaming for medical intervention. We must recognize this dark systemic truth. The heaviest pathological burdens we carry are inevitably transferred onto the shoulders of the innocent. Mrs. Kwan weeps, detailing the tactical ambush. 3 operatives breached the zone, and Ethan engaged them with the ferocity of a cornered predator to buy her time. They made him pay the ultimate physiological toll. Lucian, the cold architect of the underworld, completely unravels. A psychosomatic tremor overtakes his hands as he grips his brother, begging him to maintain visual contact. Ethan's vitals are failing, yet he weakly squeezes his brother's hand. He whispers a complete absolution, stating it is not Lucian's fault. That profound emotional grace fractures Lucian's psyche entirely. He sobs in raw agony. Ambulance lights flood the wreckage as paramedics pull Lucian away. Vivian watches the man she loves shatter into unfixable cognitive fragments. This is the tragic pathology of vengeance. It is a tax debt, always paid using the blood of the people we cherish most. Picture this psychological ground zero. You and I standing amidst the devastation. The smoke clears, leaving a silence so clinically thick it inhibits respiration. Rachel operates the phones. David manages the police, but Vivian is paralyzed by trauma. She is crushed by a horrific realization. Her father orchestrated this massacre, and an innocent boy absorbed the physical damage. She stumbles to the driveway, finding Lucian staring into the endless dark, his hands stained a terrible arterial red. When she attempts to verbally shoulder the guilt, he looks through her with hollow, dissociated eyes. He mutters his brother caught a bullet solely because he made the fatal error of forming an emotional attachment. His ironclad emotional regulation evaporates into the night air. It forces us to confront a terrifying diagnostic reality. Opening your psychological core simply provides a violent world with the perfect target to aim at. Reviewing the subject, Lucian, we observe a radical behavioral shift. He pivots with a malignant hostility, weaponizing his regret to state he should have abandoned her initially. Vivian exhibits a severe trauma recoil as he issues a dysregulated laugh. He deposits the unvarnished reality at her feet. His brother is hemorrhaging, his secure environment is compromised, and his family is targeted. He attributes this collapse entirely to her behavioral triggers. When she vocalizes the injustice, he establishes the sociopathic baseline of his reality. Insisting that civilians are always the primary fatalities, he abruptly severs their emotional bond, exiling her into the night. The clinical takeaway is absolute. When an individual pursues violent retribution, the psychological ecosystem inevitably demands the sacrifice of their primary attachment. His vocalization draws Rachel from the blood-stained residence. Vivian observes the subject who dismantled his own infrastructure to secure her safety. Now, his micro-expressions register only a freezing sociopathic hatred. She issues a fractured apology, which he dismisses immediately, stating clinically that remorse does not reverse biological death. Exhibiting acute psychological defeat, she enters the vehicle where the operative Jin maintains a rigid discipline. Lucian issues lethal directives in the background, fully regressing into an apex predator. Jin deposits her at an isolated hotel, leaving her alone. Analyzing her reflection, Vivian registers total psychological depletion. This behavioral pattern is highly predictable. Achieving dominance in a systemic conflict requires the systematic excision of every empathetic function within the human brain. Let us examine this clinical presentation together. Vivian is processing the trauma that her biological father engineered this casualty event, resulting in a juvenile hemorrhaging. Her device displays an anonymous coercive mandate demanding her return to prevent further biological terminations. Her father categorizes human assets as disposable. Rational models dictate she alert authorities, yet trauma bonding prevents us from risking the target. Demonstrating hyperarousal, she requests the location. The response dictates the Peninsula Hotel in exactly 60 minutes, unaccompanied. The pathology of devotion is fascinating. Authentic attachment compulsions consistently drive subjects to isolate themselves within hostile environments, simply to shield their primary emotional investments from total destruction. The lens captures the subject removing her biohazardous garments, experiencing physiological tremors. Evaluating her reflection, we can pronounce the psychological termination of her previous identity. She is engaged in high-risk behavioral loops with antisocial personalities, and her flight response has entirely expired. Entering a transport, she observes the urban environment through a dissociative haze. Her device registers a transmission from Jin. Despite his distress, Lucian continues to enact protective protocols. She ignores the stimulus, maintaining visual fixation on the Peninsula Hotel, a structural manifestation of narcissistic accumulation. The clinical reality is uncompromising. Optimal psychological resilience is forged in the precise market a subject terminates their avoidant behaviors and directly confronts their primary source of severe trauma. The location operates as a high-security containment zone. Vivian navigates the architecture, projecting a highly regulated effect of dominance. Her autonomic nervous system spikes when the elevator requires credentialed access. A militarized subordinate bypasses the protocol without vocalization. The vertical transit induces acute psychological distress. Mirroring the anticipation of a terminal event, she limits visual input, cognitively tethering her mental state to her primary attachments to prevent dissociation. The barrier retracts. We observe the primary antagonist, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, flanked by the architects of her clinical destabilization. The behavioral mechanics of human courage are predictable. It is never a lack of physiological terror, but rather the conscious decision to override the primal survival instinct and engage the threat vector. Let us analyze this toxic family system together. Vivian maintains an impenetrable micro-expressive barrier. The paternal figure initiates contact. Diagnosing her as a chronically destructive variable, she counter-interrogates, questioning if her pathology is surviving his betrayal or illuminating his corruption. We observe physical degradation in the father, yet he continues to deploy guilt as a manipulation tactic. The secondary subject, Antonio, emerges. Employing a modulated vocal tone, he informs her of Ethan's critical physical trauma. She accuses him of orchestrating the assassination. Antonio displays an asymmetrical smile, articulating that the environment neutralizes non-compliant elements. The psychological data is remarkably clear. High-conflict personalities will consistently distort objective reality, reframing your fundamental self-preservation mechanisms as malicious, unprovoked assaults. Vivian projects high-intensity verbal hostility, but Marcus physically intervenes, re-establishing the transactional parameters of her survival. The megalomaniac narcissist then introduces his primary ultimatum. She must fabricate an emotional breakdown for the media, falsely attribute the systemic violence to Lucian, and facilitate their integration. In exchange, her support network will avoid termination. They are effectively weaponizing her advanced empathetic capacities. She forcefully rejects the mandate to return to Damien. Her father coldly details that Damien has already been neutralized, discarded the moment his functional utility expired. This is a pristine diagnostic example of malignant acquisitiveness. Within the framework of pathological narcissism, interpersonal loyalty is a cognitive distortion. The precise microsecond a subject ceases to provide narcissistic supply, they are systematically eradicated. The zone vibrates with the dysregulated frequencies of cornered sociopaths. Federal units are establishing perimeters as the press documents their structural collapse. The paternal figure invades her proxemics, demanding she neutralize the destabilization. Maintaining ocular dominance, Vivian states they belong in the resulting incineration. However, the narcissist exploits her vulnerabilities to enforce compliance, just as her resilience threatens to fracture. A transmission from Jin confirms Ethan has stabilized post-operative trauma. An overwhelming parasympathetic response nearly compromises her physical stability. We must encode this clinical absolute. Pathological individuals will attempt to convert your prosocial empathy into a psychological prison. Maintaining your core emotional integrity is the only viable countermeasure against their pervasive toxicity. Concealing the device, a neurological activation of defiance, recalibrated Vivian's behavioral presentation. We observe a correction in her spinal alignment, signaling a shift to an offensive posture. She inverts their framework, stating her intent to facilitate their federal prosecution. Antonio exhibits a derisive vocalization, classifying her data as irrelevant. Vivian counters that the surviving juvenile will provide testimony. The narcissist dismantles this, outlining that juries inherently discount marginalized subjects in favor of high-status individuals. They intend to synthesize a media narrative framing her as a psychologically fragmented female experiencing a dissociative episode. You and I must recognize this sinister tactic together. When apex predators are confined, they do not exhibit contrition. They actively restructure historical data to diagnose the victim with severe psychopathology. The enforcer Marcus physically occludes the primary egress point. Vivian experiences an acute tachycardia response, having suppressed the data confirming her father's proficiency in lethal outcomes. She requests cognitive processing time. Antonio counters with a rigidly quantified parameter of 60 seconds. If she refuses psychological submission, her support structures will be executed. She vocalizes that they lack the capacity for such an act. Antonio closes the distance, providing a clinical reminder that they already authorized a ballistic trauma to the juvenile. As spatial disorientation sets in, a transmission flashes a critical stimulus. Surveillance protocols are active and immediate evacuation is mandatory. Never underestimate the terminal velocity of a desperate sociopath, and always initiate extraction when environmental toxicity reaches its absolute maximum. The observational lens isolates Vivian as a profound autonomic cooling takes effect. Her visual cortex registers a concealed recording mechanism. The antagonist demands she exchange her psychological autonomy for the continuation of her peers. She analyzes the paternal figure, achieving cognitive clarity regarding the disordered entity beneath the facade. A terrifying neurological equilibrium stabilizes her system. She vocalizes to confirm her decision. The narcissist falsely interprets this as compliance. Instead, she converts her device into a projectile that violently breaches the structural glass barrier. As the enforcer initiates a predatory lunge, she lowers her center of gravity, utilizing a brass fixture as a blunt instrument to shatter his patella structure. The clinical takeaway is vital. When engaging with a structurally corrupted system, your absolute best survival mechanism is to completely destabilize the operational environment. Environmental destabilization triggers a rapid mobilization of hostile assets. Vivian applies her mass against the elevator interface. The barriers retract, revealing Jin. He maintains postural rigidity, deploying a weapon with an ocular presentation entirely devoid of a fear response. He physically extracts her at the exact microsecond kinetic projectiles compromise the masonry where her cranium had been. As the seal engages, Vivian exhibits hyperventilation, questioning his tracking protocols. The clinical data reveals a startling consistency. Lucian never terminated his protective obsession. He mandated Jin to secretly monitor her behavioral footprint. They rapidly navigate the subterranean infrastructure, breaching the exterior into a designated extraction zone. Here is a definitive psychological metric. Authentic bonding is not measured by verbal commitments, but by identifying exactly who actively enters the kill zone when the trap officially initiates. Let us open this psychiatric case file together, you and I. We observe Vivian in the escaping vehicle, her breathing erratic from acute panic. She questions their destination, prompting Jin to reinforce a psychological anchor. He states the boss, despite his volatile pathology, always protects his own. Upon arriving at the safe house, Rachel interrogates Vivian's self-destructive choice to confront her toxic family unassisted. Vivian weeps, claiming a desire to shield them, displaying a classic martyrdom complex. David clinically deconstructs her delusion. Her isolation simply allowed her abusers to systematically break her spirit. The behavioral lesson is undeniable. When you insist on bearing an immense psychological burden entirely alone, you inevitably crush the very support systems trying to keep you alive. Vivian collapses onto the cushions, displaying a total failure of her defense mechanisms. She discloses the trauma inflicted by her father, a megalomaniac narcissist who promised to eliminate her loved ones, citing Ethan as proof of his lethality. The legal counsel paces, recognizing this textbook psychological warfare. Without empirical data, authorities remain paralyzed. Vivian buries her face, confessing her only victory was fleeing the environment. Then, a variable shifts. Jin emerges, revealing a concealed audio transmitter. Anticipating the abuse, he had planted a microphone on her. Every sadistic threat was clinically captured. We must observe this vital truth. Always construct a covert safety net, because a cornered sociopath will never adhere to honorable rules of engagement. Marcus exhibits grim satisfaction, labeling the auditory data irrefutable. Rachel initiates contact with federal agencies, but a dark voice paralyzes the room. Lucian materializes in the doorway. Covered in biological evidence of the recent trauma, he resembles an apparition of pure behavioral dysregulation. He confiscates the audio. For 30 agonizing seconds, he listens to his enemies terrorize violently, his primary psychological anchor. We witness a complete autonomic shift. His empathy centers shut down, replaced by the calculated rage of an apex predator. He mandates a mass dissemination of the files to all media networks, engineering the collapse of their syndicate by dawn. The clinical reality is stark. When malignant personalities push your psyche to the absolute limit, the only rational response is the total eradication of their power. Let us step into this clinical observation space together, you and I. The physical perimeter is secure, but the psychological environment is entirely destabilized. We focus on Lucian. His regulated persona has dissolved, leaving a subject suffering from acute physiological tremors. His executive function collapses as he verbally reprimands Vivian for entering a high lethality scenario unassisted. She whispers a defense rooted in her ongoing martyr complex, but his trauma response blocks all empathy. He cites the extreme violence inflicted upon his sibling by these sociopaths. The sheer autonomic terror of her potential termination has stripped away his emotional suppression. We must document this psychiatric truth. You cannot cure systemic pathology single-handedly, and embracing the martyr role only guarantees severe secondary trauma for those bonded to you. The room descends into a depressive latency. Vivian vocalizes Ethan's name, triggering an immediate parasympathetic drop in Lucian. His muscular tension evaporates under a profound somatic burden as he discloses his sibling's critical medical status. Vivian issues a fractured apology, but Lucian rejects it, his emotional shielding dismantled. He provides a raw admission that her high-risk behavioral patterns cause him severe psychological distress. Yet Vivian exhibits resilience, demanding an end to his infantilizing projections. Having survived a megalomaniac narcissist, she trusts her survival mechanics. Lucian challenges her cognitive dissonance regarding her mortality. Note this psychological law. Trauma constructs impenetrable defensive barriers, but genuine recovery requires dismantling those walls so a trusted support system can actually intervene. The ambient tension remains saturated with emotional dysregulation. Vivian maintains intense ocular focus, probing the power dynamics of their attachment. She demands to know if she is an autonomous partner or merely a dependent liability. Lucian experiences severe cognitive dissonance, admitting she occupies both roles, a paradox fracturing his psyche. Observe this relational truth. One cannot foster secure attachment while aggressively isolating a partner from environmental stresses. Abruptly, this therapeutic impasse is severed. Marcus invades the space, presenting financial ledgers like pathological evidence. Prior to Ethan's false incarceration, the narcissistic father transferred $50,000 to the primary investigator. This confirms a rotting institutional baseline. Watch the behavioral shift closely, for the final variables of this lethal equation are violently aligning. Mislabeling a massive bribe as a consulting fee is a textbook display of antisocial audacity. The investigator relocated to a remote geographical zone post-trial, extracting funds from a ghost account. He bartered his ethical mandate to decimate an innocent subject's life. The forensic reality is absolute. Malignant deception inevitably generates a verifiable data trail, regardless of the suppression tactics used. Rachel hypothesizes extracting a verbal admission, but Lucian dismisses this with clinical detachment. Subjects devoid of moral architecture do not experience remorse-induced confessions. The psychological elegance here is that verbal testimony is entirely obsolete. Marcus projects the forensic accounting onto the wall, illuminating their exhausted features. They no longer require emotional manipulation. They possess the raw quantitative data to dismantle the entire criminal network. Examine this behavioral pivot closely. We are documenting the precise moment a subject embraces the sociopathic spectrum. Resolution appears imminent until Jin receives an update and undergoes sudden vasoconstriction. 3 hostile actors attempted a lethal breach of Ethan's medical unit. One must never underestimate the extreme volatility of a threatened narcissist. We analyze Lucian's facial microexpressions. Empathy completely flatlines, substituted by the chilling, dissociated focus of premeditated violence. He issues tactical directives, initiating a localized quarantine and transmitting the forensic data to authorities. A traumatized psyche rarely tolerates bureaucratic latency, and he accelerates toward the exit. Vivian processes his trajectory, experiencing severe somatic distress as the reality solidifies. Lucian is abandoning judicial arbitration for pure, kinetic retaliation. Lucian rotates with deliberate motor function, his expression exhibiting total affective flattening. He articulates a premeditated intent to permanently terminate Antonio and the narcissistic father. Vivian vocalizes her distress, attempting to cognitively reframe his urge from justice to malignant vengeance. But the pathological seed is planted. The violence directed at his sibling has severed his reliance on institutional structures. We must diagnose this phenomenon. Retaliation is a neurochemical intoxicant that eradicates the ethical boundary between protector and predator. He clinically asserts his autonomy from her moral framework and retreats into the dark garage. Vivian pursues his path, physically engaging his rigid posture for a final psychological intervention. Executing this violence will finalize his metamorphosis into the exact sociopath he detests. Lucian halts his momentum, his dissociated gaze fixating upon her. He articulates a devastating self-assessment. He already identifies as a lethal entity, convinced that positive affective bonds cannot sanitize his historical trauma. Vivian counters his fatalism, arguing that his protective instinct toward kin validates his underlying empathy. Observe the behavioral principle. Historical data does not permanently hardwire a subject's moral compass, but immediate operative choices certainly will. Tragically, Lucian exhibits severe confirmation bias, impenetrable to her cognitive reframing. Her forcefully engages rationalizing that the opponent's aggression justifies his descent into psychopathy. He accesses the tactical vehicle, intending to isolate himself. Yet Vivian demonstrates extreme attachment behavior, entering the passenger cabin. He projects high decibel hostility, but she maintains unbroken eye contact, fully committing to the chaos. The atmospheric pressure within the mobile unit indicates critical escalation, displaying a complex manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome. Vivian fiercely bonds with her dangerous protector, commanding Jin to initiate transit. Lucian directs a fragmented stare toward her, beating unrestrained hostility and a craving for an emotional anchor. He concedes, stipulating strict containment parameters for her safety. They navigate the urban grid at high velocity, while Lucian coordinates a tactical assault via phone. He discloses the hostile assets are in a fortified structure. Vivian identifies this as a calculated environmental trap, yet his only response is the mechanical cue of a chambering firearm. The enemy vastly miscalculated this behavioral response model. Never underestimate the methodical, lethal focus of a subject whose familial unit has been violently compromised. Let us draw a final clinical conclusion, you and I. Lucian has entirely abandoned his socially acceptable facade. Systemic trauma inevitably triggers his regression to antisocial baselines. He guides Vivian into a fortified logistical hub. The sterile luminescence of tactical monitors illuminates an extensive cache of lethal hardware. Vivian exhibits a temporary cessation of respiration. Lucian analyzes her reaction, his vocal tone exhibiting zero affective resonance. He presents this heavily armed space as his authentic psychological core, challenging her delusional optimism regarding his moral salvageability. Before she can process the devastation, a high decibel proximity alarm fractures the silence. We must acknowledge this diagnostic certainty. The most sophisticated social camouflage conceals the most severe psychopathology. Never assume you have decoded a subject simply because they display a polite exterior during daylight hours. Let us open this file together, you and I. The monitor light reflects in Lucian's eyes, his face a mask of complete dissociation. The screens reveal the Antonio's hit squad speeding toward the hospital, where Ethan lies helpless. Antonio, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, believes he is untouchable. But Lucian has waited for this misstep. His voice is chillingly calm as he orders his men to spring the trap, overriding police frequencies and cashing in every dark favor. Vivian watches this violent symphony in total awe. Sirens and private security swarm the intersection, neutralizing the assassins miles from his brother. The clinical takeaway here is vital. Your alliances are your ultimate armor. Build strong bonds while the water is calm, because you will desperately need them when the storm breaks. The Feed's capture a bloody nightmare. Antonio's men try to break the perimeter, but they are sealed in silent flashes of gunfire, illuminate the monitors in violent white light. Vivian stands paralyzed, observing this clinical choreography of death. 90 seconds later, the street goes perfectly still. Lucien answers a phone with a hollow, detached tone, ordering the bodies processed. Miles away, Antonio experiences a severe narcissistic collapse as his empire falls. Vivian's adrenaline spikes, ready to march into the fire herself. But Lucien blocks the heavy door, refusing to let her die for a reckless trauma response. The behavioral lesson is clear. Sometimes holding your ground is the truest courage. Never let your boiling rage march you blindfolded into an open grave. Lucien holds her gaze, the dim light catching the psychological ruin in his eyes. He tells her to keep breathing while he burns his world to ash. But Vivian refuses to be a passive victim. She steps forward, warning that if he pulls the trigger, he will rot in a cell forever. Lucien whispers that her safety is worth the destruction of his soul, a devastating confession of trauma bonding. Yet Vivian moves closer. She did not claw her way out of the dark just to watch him drown. She demands to stand by his side as an equal, and you and I can almost as the defensive ice around his psyche fracture. Remember this clinical truth: true loyalty is never about blind support. It is about grabbing the people you love by the shoulders and dragging them back from the bitter edge. The silence stretches, heavy with unspoken neuroses. Lucien reaches out, his trembling fingers brushing her cheek. "You are out of your mind," he whispers, his voice thick with repressed sorrow. She refuses to break eye contact, softly replying that he is exactly the same. She pleads with him to break the cycle of violence and end this without more blood. Lucien's jaw tightens, the brutal cognitive dissonance clear on his face. He asks how he can let the men who traumatized her keep breathing. She counters his violent ideation, insisting real justice does not require a single bullet. In that fragile second, his hardened defenses yield. He calls the authorities, surrendering his violent compulsions. Retaliation might offer a quick dopamine rush, but the absolute greatest victory is walking away with a clean soul. The receiver clatters against the concrete in the suffocating silence. Stick with me here, because desperate minds rarely wait for sirens. We observe Vivian marching to the iron table, grabbing a stun weapon in a display of hyper-arousal. Lucien tries to ground her. He warns her it carries 50,000 volts, asking if she is prepared to cross that violent threshold. She answers by strapping a heavy vest over her chest. Suddenly, the door flies open. The security feeds show a frantic figure sprinting through the wet alleys. It is Richard. Her father exhibits classic self-preservation, abandoning his daughter to save his own skin, prompting Lucien to bolt for the exit. You can sprint away from your worst mistakes for years, but the truth is always waiting quietly at your back door. Tires scream as their sedan tears out of the garage. Vivian stares at the screen, experiencing acute tachycardia. Lucien notes Richard is heading for the marina, his voice eerily calm. This is the classic exit strategy for cornered narcissists suffocating under their corruption. They reach the docks as freezing rain falls. Vivian spots him instantly. Richard is sprinting toward a luxury yacht, his face twisted with primal terror. She screams his name and he freezes. When he turns, his eyes are pathetic, begging them to run before the syndicate destroys them. Lucien steps forward, physically blocking the path to the water as sirens wail in the distance. Stolen money might buy a luxury boat, but it will never buy an escape from your own psychological shadow. Richard spins one last lie, insisting he is running to draw the violence away from her. This gaslighting is agonizing to observe. Vivian stands in the downpour, trembling as years of repressed trauma finally boil over. She screams at him, severing the emotional attachment. She declares he lost the right to be a father the night he traded her safety to a megalomaniac. Every narcissistic choice he made is laid bare on the wet pier. She was never a daughter, merely a transactional pawn. Stripped of his sociopathic excuses, the polished businessman vanishes. All that remains is a broken man choking on his bitter tears. Let us evaluate this hard truth together. A bloodline is just simple biology. True family is built on protection, and no one gets a free pass to hurt you just because they gave you your name. He babbles into the storm, rationalizing how the corrupt merger was meant to fix his failures. He falls to his knees, swearing Antonio threatened her life. Vivian laughs hollowly, recognizing the cognitive distortion. Trading your child to a psychopath is not protection. It is ultimate cowardice. Flashing lights paint the docks as authorities arrive. Panic flashes in Richard's eyes. His fight-or-flight response activates, and he reaches into his coat. Lucian draws his weapon with lethal hypervigilance. Richard begs him not to shoot, pulling out a sealed envelope holding the hidden bank routes Antonio never knew about. He offers it to Vivian, urging her to dismantle the kingpin. The lesson remains. It is never too late to offer a piece of redemption, even if you never get to sit in its shade. The psychological irony here is immense. Richard whispers for Lucian to protect his daughter, then sprints for the water. His pathology is unchanged. He chooses escape over the traumatized child in front of him. Lucian shouts a warning, but Vivian stands frozen on the pier in a dissociative state. Federal agents swarm the area. Richard delusionally thinks he can make to the edge. Suddenly, blinding searchlights from a Coast Guard vessel cut the fog. A booming megaphone echoes over the waves, destroying his final illusion of control. They drag him back up the ramp in cold steel cuffs, his posture slumped in defeat. You can try to outrun the ghosts of your past, but the ocean of your mistakes will always wash you right back to shore. The bill for betrayal always comes due. As agents march him up the planks, Richard stops near the daughter he psychologically destroyed, offering a fragile apology. Look closely at the conflict in Vivian's eyes. She wants restitution for the years he traded for dirty money. Instead, she delivers the most devastating behavioral punishment available: absolute silence. When they lock him away, the adrenaline drops. She crushes the envelope against her chest, hyperventilating, as reality crashes down. Lucian steps close, his hand grounding her shoulder to tether her to the present. The violent megalomaniacs are going away in chains. Yet, standing in the freezing rain, the victory feels exactly like ashes. Cutting toxic roots of your life will save you, but you still have to learn to live with the empty space they leave behind. Instead of relief, Vivian experiences an emotional void. She and Lucian drive into the night, seeking the grounding presence of Ethan. The hospital is a fortress guarded by federal agents. Ethan is medically compromised, but his eyes are conscious. Mrs. Kwan sits beside the bed, holding his hand in a display of secure attachment. When Ethan sees Lucian, he cracks a weak smile, using humor as a coping mechanism. Lucian freezes, his brain struggling to process the survival of his primary emotional anchor. He steps forward, gripping his brother's shoulder with gentle desperation. We often forget how fragile these psychological ties are. You never realize how much you value someone until the universe threatens to take them away. Cutting through the emotion, Ethan asks if they finally dismantled the syndicate. The hospital lights hum as Vivian delivers the clinical facts. Her father and Antonio are in federal holding. The frame job has unraveled, wiping Ethan's name clean. Watch his posture closely with me. When Lucian confirms his restored reputation, 3 years of cognitive weight physically break him. He collapses into cathartic tears. Vivian observes this raw, emotional release. Tonight, she severed a toxic bloodline to bond with a chosen family. The people who bleed for you are your true kin. That is a psychological lesson you carry forever. But just as their nervous systems begin to regulate, a harsh electronic shriek shatters the ward. Code blue. Red emergency lights pulse down the corridor, a cruel warning that the trauma of this war is far from its final act. Let us examine this clinical file together, shall we? Observe how the environment violently snaps. Medics sprint past the lens, screaming about a live explosive threat. In a fraction of a second, the relief in the subject, Lucian S. eyes hardens into cold terror. He recognizes this as Antonio S. Endgame, a textbook move by a megalomaniacal narcissist. Nurses throw Ethan onto a gurney, rushing for the stairwell. It is pure trauma, a stampede choking the hall. Vivian clings to Lucian, but as they reach the fire doors, she catches a terrifying anomaly. Marcus Chen. The assassin wears faded scrubs, weapon aimed dead at Ethan S. chest. Psychological lesson is simple. Desperate at subjects with nothing to lose will always take the most fatal shots. Never turn your back until the monster is buried. Vivian's scream cuts through the alarms. Marcus raises his weapon, but Lucian moves with predatory speed, shoving her behind him while drawing his own firearm. A gunshot shatters the hallway. But analyze the variables closely. The projectile does not come from Marcus. Jin steps out from the swirling smoke, landing a clean shot in the assassin's shoulder. Marcus hits the linoleum hard, instantly subdued by guards. Lucian aims down at the bleeding hitman, his expression utterly void of empathy. Yet, Marcus spits a bloody laugh, whispering that Antonio S. war will not stop until the earth takes them all. The bomb threat was a phantom variable designed to isolate the targets. The clinical lesson is grim. To cure a truly malignant pathology, you must be prepared to sever every root. The worst villains never surrender quietly. Guards drag Marcus away, leaving a dark streak across the tiles. Federal agents swarm the clinical environment, clearing the ward. The explosive threat was a sick manipulation to isolate Ethan, and it nearly succeeded. Notice how Vivian slumps against the plaster, her chest heaving as the acute stress settles. Just 4 days ago, she wept in a torn wedding gown. Tonight, she is dodging bullets. The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Life pivots in a blink, and the lesson is clear. You can never predict where your loyalties will drag you, so you must learn to breathe inside the fire. In the background, Lucian paces like a caged predator, barking orders. Meanwhile, Ethan lies pale upon the gurney, employing dark humor as a psychological defense mechanism against the terror. The heavy doors lock as Ethan is wheeled into a secure room. He lets out a breathless laugh, noting they end his life twice in 24 hours. Lucian snapped that it is not a joke, but analyzed the micro-expressions in his voice. It is the fragile relief of a brother staring at a survivor. Once guarded, Lucian pulls Vivian into a dim conference room. The shadows highlight the deep exhaustion carved into his jawline. He is a subject burning his final drop of adrenaline. He leans close, revealing a terrifying variable. Marcus had inside help. Someone bypassed security to hand him those scrubs. The behavioral lesson here is critical. If you believe severing a snake's head stops the bite, you are mistaken. Antonio's hidden pawns are still moving, silently waiting for the kill. Let us pause and unpack this psychological climax together. Antonio realizes his narcissistic empire is crumbling, so he chooses to burn the earth and slaughter the witnesses. Watch Vivian beg for a rational strategy, but observe the empathy completely die in Lucian's eyes. His voice drops to a hollow whisper, declaring the death of mercy. When Vivian pleads for him to trust the law, he sneers, reminding her those same scene courts nearly buried his brother. He plans to breach federal holding and execute Antonio with his own hands. She panics, calling it suicide. Lucian just leans in, breathing two chilling words. Watch me. The clinical tragedy here is unsettling. When society's bright rules fail to protect the innocent, the pull of the dark becomes magnetic. To save your blood, you will gladly become the monster. Tears fall as Vivian begs Lucian not to throw his psychological rehabilitation into the fire. She demands to know how a concrete cell saves anyone. But Lucian is dissociating. He replies, with a hauntingly soft cadence, that it will finally let him sleep. She grips his arm, reminding him he bled to escape this syndicate 3 years ago. He removes her hand, whispering that he is no longer angry, he's purely homicidal. He sharply orders her to step back, claiming she has no right to manage how he protects his blood. The rejection strikes her like a blow. Her posture collapses, absorbing the guilt of bringing this violence to his door. But hear this clinical truth. Taking the blame for a trauma you did not create is a fatal trap. You cannot save loved ones by crucifying yourself. Vivian spirals into a panic attack, breathing chateau as she tallies the collateral damage. Ethan shot, Mrs. Kwan beaten. Lucian preparing to burn his soul. In her mind, she is the architect of this graveyard. The clinical silence is broken by Lucian's dark laugh. The dynamic shifts. He steps into her space, softening as he shatters her cognitive distortion. He murmurs that she is not the pathogen, she is the cure. Without her defiance, his brother would be in a cell, and Antonio would still pull the psychological strings. He raises his bruised hands, framing her face, reminding her that dismantling a dynasty demands a heavy toll. Doing the righteous thing is meant to bleed. When you fight a narcissistic monster, expect the venom to splash. Enduring that poison is your greatest victory. Her voice breaks as she asks how any psyche survives a war with no horizon. Lucian's harsh angles melt. He tells her you've already find a single grounding variable worth protecting and hold on until you bleed. When she asks what he is holding on to, he traces her cheekbone and breathes one word, you. It is a moment of profound trauma-bonded romance, a dynamic I often note in my clinical files. Suddenly, his phone shatters the peace. It is Rachel. Watch the terrifying behavioral shift. Lucian turns from an exhausted lover back into a cold-blooded boss in a blink. He relays the grim truth. Antonio was just found hanging inside his cell. The lesson is written in blood. Never lower your guard when a predator is cornered. When you assume the psychological game is over, the monster plays its most chaotic hand. Rachel confirms Antonio survived the hanging attempt. Lucian's analytical mind instantly dissects the crime scene. He notes the makeshift rope was suspiciously weak. Vivian drops a clinical hypothesis that chills the blood. What if this gruesome display is just theater? Antonio is a masterful conductor of psychological chaos. A megalomaniac that proud does not quietly bow out. He deliberately pulled the federal spotlight onto his own bleeding neck, giving his loyalists cover to execute the real strike. Lucian immediately radios his guards, ordering them to barricade Ethan's door, even if the hospital burns. The lesson here should deeply scare you. When a narcissistic manipulator suddenly plays the tragic victim, aggressively check your blind spots. They will gladly stage their own demise to lure you into an early grave. Let you and I evaluate this psychological chessboard together. Vivian scans the pieces. Her father bleeds in a maximum security cell, while Marcus is chained to a hospital frame. Every known demon appears caged, but Lucian understands the terrifying pathology of the syndicate. Antonio is not trying to escape punishment. He is sending a deafening message to the underworld. By attempting to take his own life, he chose absolute silence over a federal plea deal. He is shielding the untouchable elites who fund the operation. If he dies, the billionaires walk away spotless. Rachel confirms the bleak reality. Corporate lawyers will stall this trial for decades. This is a bitter life lesson I see constantly in my work. The golden scales of justice are heavily rigged. The true architects of suffering always hide quietly behind the bleeding fall guy. The temperature in the sterile room violently plummets. Lucian S. voice drops into a dead baritone, demanding 5 minutes alone in Antonio S. cell. Rachel fiercely pushes back, reminding him the man is surrounded by federal rifles. But look at Lucian S. hands. He is entirely consumed by the intoxicating cycle of violence, fingers trembling over the cold steel in his coat. The psychological torture here is profound to witness. The narcissistic monster who just tried to slaughter his brother is the same father figure who shielded him as a boy. After watching his family bleed for so long, Lucian has slipped the leash, completely deaf to logic. This is the tragic climax of severe trauma. Handing the wheel over to your unresolved pain might make you feel like a god, but blind vengeance will only torch the exact sanctuary you sacrificed everything to build. You and I have studied this exact behavioral loop in maximum security wards. Vivian clings to Luca, exhibiting classic savior complex, desperately hoping her affection can override his pathology. She warns him against crossing the line, fearing he will become the monster society expects. But look at his eyes, total limbic shutdown, 2 black stones void of empathy. He calmly diagnoses his condition, admitting the monster was always his baseline personality. She merely suffered from willful blindness. The doors slam shut, severing the trauma bond. The clinical takeaway here is absolute. You cannot cure a severely fractured psyche with romance. If a subject has built their psychological foundation in the dark, your love will never pull them into the light. The atmospheric tension mirrors the claustrophobia I usually observe in holding cells. Vivian rationalizes their trauma, noting that justice is a psychological luxury for subjects who never dodge bullets for survival. A ringing phone disrupts the baseline anxiety. Rachel takes the call, and the physiological shift is immediate. Vivian S. father is exhibiting textbook ego preservation. He is folding, ready to dismantle Antonio S. narcissistic empire with paper trails rather than violence. But a critical variable remains uncontrolled. Luca is roaming the cell blocks, driven by sheer hyper-vigilance, seconds away from a fatal psychotic break. Vivian screams to intercept him. The behavioral lesson is clear. Impulse control is a supreme cognitive advantage. Blind vengeance will always incinerate the survival you just secured. Let us examine the physiology of a crisis. Vivian forces her way through security, sprinting down the concrete corridor. She finds Luca paralyzed in a classic fight-or-flight freeze, his weapon trembling. His posture displays massive cognitive dissonance, torn between his past and the megalomaniac narcissist Antonio has become. She introduces a new variable. Her father is informing on the syndicate, engineering a total systemic collapse. She anchors Luca's dissociation, whispering that victory only actualizes if he disengages his violent conditioning right now. It is a massive psychological pivot. The clinical reality of this moment, the most effective retaliation, does not require physical violence. True dominance is stepping back and allowing institutional predators to consume your abusers. Rachel processes the target list, exposing the full scope of the criminal pathology. Richard's defection will neutralize 7 key operators, including shielded politicians. You can physically observe the cortisol draining from Luca's nervous system. The acute adrenaline cycle breaks, replaced by profound exhaustion typical in post-trauma survivors. Denied his physical kill, he instead achieves a rare psychological emancipation. The empire is terminated. Then, Vivian asks the unavoidable question regarding her primary caregiver. The protocol is witness protection. Her father will be erased. The psychological truth here is fascinating. Genuine cognitive victory is rarely about standing triumphantly over the wreckage of your abuser. The healthiest adaptation is simply knowing when to walk away. They allocate 15 minutes, and the acoustic isolation mimics a solitary confinement ward. Richard, previously exhibiting grandiose delusions of control, now presents as physically diminished. When he attempts to stand, physical restraints correct his posture. Vivian observes him, experiencing intense cognitive dissonance regarding her childhood. Suddenly, Richard's ego defenses collapse. He cries, confessing he sacrificed Ethan as a standard self-preservation tactic. Vivian does not succumb to empathy. She surgically dissects his display, asking if he experiences genuine remorse or merely the panic of a trapped organism. He quietly admits to the latter. The behavioral diagnosis is stark. An apology devoid of behavioral change is simply a manipulator attempting to purchase emotional amnesty. Stick with me here because the systemic dysfunction is staggering. Richard admits the megalomaniac narcissist Antonio utilized financial blackmail as a primary behavioral leash. For 36 months, Richard maintained his facade while silently funding his daughter's psychological destruction. Vivian questions her engagement to Damien. Richard dismantles her reality, classifying the relationship as a calculated asset transfer. He commodified his own offspring to maintain his hierarchy, ignoring Damien's overt sociopathy. This illustrates a fundamental psychological law. Deception functions as a high-interest emotional loan. You might sustain the cognitive load temporarily, but the compound interest will inevitably bankrupt your sanity. Fluid streams down Richard's face, a physiological response to the collapse of his narcissism. He verbally processes his descent into systemic corruption, categorizing himself as a paternal failure. I watch Vivian's baseline. She exhibits flat affect. The rage has burned out, leaving pure emotional desensitization. She observes this fractured specimen and states, with zero vocal fluctuation, that forgiveness is off the table. She hopes dismantling the cartel provides serotonin in his isolation cell. As she pivots, Richard projects his desperation, screaming his affection at the cinderblock walls. The clinical observation here is vital. Forgiveness is an internal coping strategy, not a required social contract. You are never obligated to rehabilitate the psychological predators who shattered your reality. You and I know the final verbal strike is always the most calculated. Vivian halts at the threshold. She validates his affection, noting that his capacity to love is precisely what maximizes the psychological trauma. Then she extracts herself. The timeline accelerates into systemic disintegration. Richard provides the data. Antonio's parasitic organization experiences total structural failure. Marcus flips, and Damien is socially eradicated by his own gene pool. When a biological sibling attempts contact, Vivian observes the notification and lets the stimulus fade. The conditioning is broken. The diagnostic takeaway is harsh. Objective reality will frequently obliterate your perceived safety. But total structural collapse is required to construct a healthy cognitive baseline. The neurochemical chaos is finally stabilizing. Vivian monitors the phone until the screen terminates. Luca has displayed remarkable behavioral restraint, acting as a stable anchor. Ethan is undergoing cognitive rehabilitation, pivoting his trauma into a legal fixation to combat systemic predators. Seated within the controlled environment of Mrs. Kwan's residence, Vivian experiences the serotonin response of a surrogate family. But an internal diagnostic check reveals lingering dissonance. This habitat is entirely constructed around shared survival. She requires an uncontaminated environment. The psychological principle is clear. A trauma-bonded support system is a crucial stabilizing agent, but you cannot construct a functional identity inside the architecture of your worst memories. True individuation requires isolation. 8 weeks post-collapse. The auditory absence following a prolonged, hypervigilant state is often deafening. On the terrace, Vivian introduces a variable that disrupts Lucian's emotional homeostasis. She is abandoning the geographic location. She must isolate her core personality from the professional survivor she was forced to become. Lucian's immediate response is classic trauma bonding. He volunteers to migrate with her. Vivian rejects the dependency. She clinically points out that his fractured network requires stabilizing, and Ethan relies on his behavioral model. The observation here is fundamental to human psychology. You can navigate severe environmental threats with a synchronized pack, but the neurological process of self-actualization, that requires a completely solitary environment. Let us observe the defense mechanisms disintegrate. Vivian displays severe neurological fatigue, hypothesizing that her entire behavioral matrix is now a mere trauma response. She requires a baseline without threat assessment. Lucian's micro-expressions betray his intense fear of abandonment. What if her migration is permanent? She maintains her boundary. Clarifying her self-extraction is about eliminating fear as a primary motivator. Lucian exhibits remarkable ego control. He validates her logic despite his own limbic distress. The behavioral deduction is beautiful. Healthy attachment is not about isolating a subject within your own psychological loop. It is about facilitating their autonomy. For 14 days, they suspend their anxiety, existing entirely in the present tense. For a fortnight, they drop off the psychological radar. They utilize quiet spaces where Lucian is perceived as a standard human, not an apex predator. Vivian playfully analyzes him, suggesting a functional emotional core exists beneath his cold exterior. On the final night, he transports her to an isolated coastline. No artificial stimuli, just the acoustic frequency of the ocean. The silence is dense until Lucian vocalizes his attachment trauma, asking one last time for a predictive outcome. Vivian overrides her impulse to pacify him. She suppresses the false reassurance. You and I know why this matters. Projecting a fictional future is a form of cognitive abuse. Supplying fabricated data will always induce a far more catastrophic trauma than letting an honest, agonizing silence stand. Let us open this final, fascinating case file together, you and I. Observe the clinical separation in this frame. The camera lingers on Lucian. Notice his heavy nod, a rare surrender of control for a man conditioned for absolute dominance. They sit in the silence of a bruised sunset, two subjects who dragged each other from profound psychological wreckage. Vivian S. Baggs sit by the door, a physical manifestation of her new boundaries. Mrs. Kwan presses a warm parcel into her traumatized hands. At the airport gate, the civilian world blurs past in an ignorant rush. She whispers gratitude. He validates her trust. Here is the clinical truth we often see in psychiatric recovery. The most brutal phase of healing requires the terrifying, agonizing courage to simply turn your back and walk away. A fractured laugh escapes Vivian as she admits trusting him when her survival instincts screamed to flee. We see the lingering shadows of Stockholm Syndrome here, that profound bond between a victim and her captor. She turns to leave, but Lucien catches her hand, his voice dropping into a desperate gravel. He promises to wait if she ever desires permanence. The words catch like glass in her throat. She walks through security, eyes locked dead ahead, knowing one backward glance will shatter her psychological resolve. We dissolve through 6 months of exile, trading trauma-soaked Miami nights for a sun-drenched Tuscan hillside. Sometimes, a patient must completely abandon their toxic environment and step blindly into the terrifying unknown to uncover who they are truly meant to be. Vivian isolates herself in a crumbling cottage, engaging in physical sublimation. She uses the grueling harvest labor to exhaust her hyperactive nervous system. The dark soil under her fingernails grounds her mind in ways Mafia blood never could. She bleeds her complex trauma onto paper until the terrified Miami girl becomes a behavioral phantom. Then, her phone flares in the dark. It is Lucien. She answers, trading jokes about Italian quiet versus their bloody shared past. He mentions the others are thriving, but the dialogue suddenly fades into a loaded pause, suffocating the line. The psychological truth is inevitable. Deeply entrenched trauma bonds never truly vanish across the miles. They simply wait in the absolute dark for the precise moment to pull you back. Let us look closely at this behavioral shift together. The syndicate boss is on the line, his voice steeped in dangerous nostalgia. Vivian S. posture does not waver. She delivers a brutal reality check, her tone stripped of the paralyzing fear that once defined her. She is finished with the criminal shadows. Miles away, a proud smile pulls at Lucien S. mouth. He recognizes she has finally reclaimed her autonomy. She misses her support system, but refuses to return to Miami. That city is a massive environmental trigger, buried under too many corpses. Staring across the Tuscan valleys, she achieves cognitive clarity. The ultimate assertion of dominance is not conquering your enemies. It is possessing the courage to permanently walk away from the venomous environment that broke you. Instead of remeasuring, Vivian initiates a breathtaking psychological curveball. She asks how he feels about Tuscany, intending to buy an abandoned vineyard. This is no front for laundering money. It is a drive to build something authentic. She describes waking up with zero hypervigilance, no target on her back. Lucien falls into a deafening silence. For a man accustomed to the absolute control of a megalomaniac narcissist, where surrendering his empires is unthinkable, yet he delivers the fatal blow to his own pathology. Send me the listing details. 3 months later, a black SUV crunches up her sun-baked driveway. You simply cannot heal profound trauma in the exact same poisoned soil that broke you. You must leave the dark ruins behind and plant your roots where the light actually reaches you. The frame opens on overgrown weeds and a ruined farmhouse. Clinically, this is the perfect canvas for cognitive restructuring. The SUV doors swing open. Lucien steps out, presenting a jarring behavioral contrast in a razor-sharp suit, right in the deep Tuscan mud. Ethan bounds out with a wild grin while Mrs. Kwan begins plotting the demolition of rotting beams. Lucian lets out a deep laugh, joking he abandoned his sanity in Miami to buy this dirt. But the genuine emotional warmth in his dark eyes is a real breakthrough. It reinforces a fundamental psychiatric law. Radical behavioral change is always destined to be a chaotic mess. But when you stand alongside the secure attachments you deliberately chose, even a collapsing pile of broken bricks feels exactly like a safe sanctuary. Stick with me here. This is the raw psychological pivot of our case study. Lucian steps close to Vivian, his ego desperately trying to maintain its defensive facade. He rationalizes the ruined acres as a corporate expansion. Vivian calls his bluff, demanding the truth of why he crossed an ocean. He locks onto her eyes, finally letting his heavy, narcissistic armor crash to the floor. He confesses that isolation forced him to confront the clinically hollow man he was beneath the Mafia crown. He simply wants to carve out a quiet life with her. As tears trace her cheeks, a profound behavioral lesson emerges. True psychological power is never measured by the graveyards you fill. It is found in the agonizing courage to drop your defense mechanisms and actively choose peace. We watch this syndicate boss execute enemies with the precision of a true sociopath. Yet, now, he stands in dead earth, his voice cracking with vulnerability. He pleads with her to build something clean. No lingering trauma ghosts, no systemic revenge. Vivian sobs, warning him that their ingrained behavioral patterns are far too stubborn not to clash. Lucian simply pulls her against his chest, physically grounding her nervous system. She gazes up at the phantom who originally triggered her Stockholm syndrome and breathes a conscious yes. As they kiss, the cortisol-soaked trauma of Miami dissolves. Secure attachment is never found in the crossfire. It is forged by doing the agonizing cognitive work when the smoke clears, building a sanctuary together, brick by brick. The tension of that breakthrough is shattered by grounding reality. Mrs. Kwan screams that the roof is caving in while Ethan doubles over laughing. This marks the moment their collective hypervigilance finally breaks. We jump forward 5 years. The psychological transformation is staggering. That cursed mud is now a sprawling vineyard. For years, Vivian was traded like a powerless object on a criminal ledger, but standing in the sunlight of her own land, her brain has fully rewired itself. She is the active architect of her fate. The profound psychiatric beauty of this case lies here. You cannot control the toxic environments you were forced into, but you always possess the conscious power to walk away, stitch your wounds, and build a healthy reality from the dirt up. The storm of their past has broken, establishing a stable emotional baseline. A brilliant sunrise bleeds over the hills as Vivian walks the rows. She is a complete psychological ghost to that terrified girl on the Miami balcony. The quiet suddenly ruptures into joyous chaos as her young daughter tears through the vines. Right on her heels is Lucian. The once lethal boss carries their infant son on his shoulders, his deep laughter echoing. He successfully traded his maladaptive empire for the profound grounding of fatherhood. Even Ethan let his return ticket expire, choosing healthy integration. The clinical data proves something vital here. The loyal individuals who help regulate your nervous system during the darkest storms will inevitably forge the family unit you truly deserve. Ethan surrendered his defensive edge. He fell in love with a local woman, trading his violent history for genuine intimacy. Now a full-time uncle, he watches the kitchen dissolve into domestic poetry, Mrs. Kwan and Safia battle playfully, shouting in an unregulated symphony of Korean and Italian. Ethan leans against the stone, enjoying the harmless drama. He shakes his head, declaring the family clinically insane. Vivian fires back, mocking his endless vacation. Laughter rattles the beams, filling Vivian's chest with a flood of serotonin. You and I have probably made this exact mistake, assuming peace means absolute silence. But remember this well. A rehabilitated life is never sterile. It is spectacularly loud, messy, and fiercely guarded by the chaotic people who love you without condition. Let us bring this case file to its close together. The coffee cools as Lucian and Vivian step onto their terrace. They traded the hyper-stimulating neon of Miami for the grounding quiet of the vineyards. Lucian asks if the neurological ghosts of their violent past ever call out. She does not blink. She acknowledges the adrenaline it took to survive, but those trauma games are dead. Zero regrets. Then Lucian speaks. Antonio Torres is dead. The megalomaniac narcissist who shot Ethan died alone in a freezing maximum security cell. His corrupted heart gave out at 63. You and I know how deeply unfair this world can be. But wrap this final psychiatric truth around your mind. Sometimes you never have to raise your fists. Time will quietly fight your hardest battles for you. Vivian looks at Lucian and asks how he feels. In my line of work, evaluating syndicate enforcers, you expect a man like him to report a rush of adrenaline. Instead, Lucian exhales, reporting only a bone-deep exhaustion. His hypervigilance has finally broken. Vivian observes this and speaks a profound clinical truth. That paralyzing fatigue is the physiological symptom of real psychological growth. Down below, their children toss pebbles into a fountain. Her voice drops to a whisper as she thanks him for what happened on those cathedral steps years ago, for recognizing her humanity instead of treating her as a tactical asset. He pulls her close, kissing her forehead. You see, true loyalty is never about dramatic rescues. It is choosing to stay when a person is entirely depleted, offering nothing but their fractured self. Lucian maintains eye contact, softly admitting that she saved him too. He was drowning in a pathological cycle of vengeance, hollowed out by violence. She provided the psychological lifeline. This is a staggering confession from a man conditioned to break bones for a living. When their daughter calls out from the grass, they just walk to her. He is no longer scanning the perimeter for threats. Later that evening, Vivian asks if her former self would be happy right now. Lucian is brutally honest. He says the old Vivian would be terrified because dismantling your defense mechanisms is far harder than pulling a trigger. But she would be undeniably proud. You and I must remember this simple truth. Anyone can survive a bitter conflict, but it takes monumental courage to drop your weapons and build a beautiful life out of the rubble. He takes her hand in the cool night air, verbalizing a massive cognitive shift. He tells her that maintaining faith in human goodness requires significantly more mental fortitude than throwing a punch. Vivian squeezes his fingers, smiling as she asks when the cartel enforcer became a philosopher. Probably the day I bought a vineyard. Without knowing a thing about grapes, he laughs. Down in the valley, church bells chime, triggering a flashback for Vivian. She remembers sitting in the freezing rain in a ruined wedding dress after a catastrophic betrayal. She was convinced her life was terminating on those cold stones. Instead, she fought her way out of that severe psychological abyss. Listen to me closely on this one. Your absolute darkest, most agonizing trauma might just be the painful hard reset you desperately need to reclaim your life. Picture the quiet hills of Tuscany as a cold wind rustles through the grapevines. Vivian stands perfectly still. As an analyst, I immediately notice the subtle drop of her shoulders. The moonlight catches a faint scar on her neck, but her eyes no longer display the rapid, anxious movement of hunted prey. The spilled blood, the betrayals, the antisocial predators who tried to systematically break her psyche, they belong to the past now. She is simply breathing. The metallic scent of violence has finally faded into the grounding smell of damp soil. We all fight our own private psychological wars, holding on to venom, craving the ruin of those who abused us. But the absolute greatest revenge you can achieve in this world is finding your own quiet peace and making sure your enemies never touch it again. The final lesson from Vivienne's journey is that freedom often comes with loss. When Vivienne refuses to marry Damien, she loses her family's approval, her financial safety, her social position, and the future she thought she was building. Her father threatens to cut her off completely. The merger collapses. The life she knew is destroyed. But the story shows that not every loss is a tragedy. Some losses are the price of escaping a life that was never truly yours. Vivienne's old life looked glamorous from the outside. A wedding fiancé, a powerful family, a beautiful wedding, and a future connected to influence. But underneath, it was a cage. Her choices were controlled by business interests. Her pain was ignored. Her value was measured by what she could provide to others. By walking away, she loses comfort, but she gains ownership of herself. This is a deeply educational message. Many people stay in harmful situations because they fear losing money, status, relationships, or identity. The story reminds us that security without dignity is not real security. Vivienne's freedom begins the moment she accepts that being cut off may be painful, but being controlled would be worse. She chooses dignity over inheritance, truth over reputation, and self-respect over comfort. This does not mean freedom is easy. The story makes clear that choosing yourself can lead to conflict, lead to danger and uncertainty. But it also opens the possibility of a future built on honesty. Vivienne's lesson is that sometimes the life you are afraid to lose is the life that is keeping you trapped. Real freedom may require burning bridges, disappointing people, and starting over. But if the old world only valued your obedience, then choosing it may be the beginning of becoming whole.